The subcommittee will come to order. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to address the guests in our audience. First of all, thank you all for coming. We think engaged citizens are a welcome and valuable part of the political process. I only wish every hearing drew this much interest. The purpose of this hearing is to examine FDA's role in regulating genetically modified food ingredients, and it is an opportunity for this committee to ask questions and have a thoughtful discussion on this issue. The number of people in this audience and in the hallway this morning demonstrates the strong interest in this topic, and we welcome that interest and your attendance here today. I do want to remind our guest that the chair is obligated under the rules of the House and rules of the committee to maintain order, preserve decorum in the committee room, and I know that we all may not agree on this topic, but I ask that we all abide by these rules and be respectful of our audience members, our viewers, and our witnesses. And the chair appreciates the audience's cooperation in maintaining order as we have a full discussion on this important issue this morning. The chair will now recognize himself for an opening statement. The genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, is a term that refers to ingredients sourced from crops that have been genetically engineered to express certain traits or characteristics. A number of people have an instinctive distrust of food that has been genetically modified and are asking questions about its safety. Others see great promise for better nutrition and the alleviation of hunger around the world. There are real sensitivities around this issue and all issues regarding the food we eat and feed our children and our grandchildren. It is our job as policymakers, particularly as it relates to the public health, to establish a factually and scientifically sound foundation prior to taking any action that would impact consumers and our economy. And this hearing provides a great opportunity to put rhetoric aside and do just that. GMOs have been a part of the U.S. food supply since the mid-1990s. In fact, as much as 90% of our corn, sugar beet, and soybean crops are now genetically engineered, and about 70% of processed foods contain such ingredients. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration oversees the safety and labeling of all food products from plant sources, including those from genetically engineered crops. These products must meet the same safety requirements as foods from traditionally bred crops. The Food and Drug Administration currently has a consultation process in place in which developers of the underlying technologies address any outstanding safety or other regulatory issues with the agency prior to marketing their products. FDA has completed approximately 100 of such consultations. No products have gone to market until FDA's safety-related questions have been resolved. According to FDA Commissioner Margaret Hamburg, FDA has, quote, not seen evidence of safety risk associated with genetically modified foods, end quote. Further, FDA has no basis for concluding that bioengineered foods are different from other foods in any meaningful way, and the World Health Organization has stated that, quote, no effects on human health have been shown as a result of consumption of such foods, end quote. In fact, they can grow faster, resist diseases and drought, lower reliance on pesticides, cost less, and prove more nutritious. Even President Obama has stated that, quote, advances in the genetic engineering of plants have provided enormous benefits to American farmers, and that investment in enhanced biotechnology is an essential component of the solution to some of our planet's most pressing agricultural problems, end quote. Nonetheless, there have recently been a number of state initiatives calling for the mandatory labeling of food products that contain GMOs, and we will hear today from a number of witnesses who can speak to such actions and the impact they would have. Food labeling is a matter of interstate commerce and is therefore clearly a federal issue that rightfully resides with Congress and the FDA. I am concerned that a patchwork of 50 separate state labeling schemes would be impractical and unworkable. Such a system would create confusion among consumers and result in higher prices and fewer options. Finally, I want to commend Representative Mike Pompeo and Representative Butterfield for their leadership on these issues. I look forward to learning more about H.R. 4432, the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act of 2014, and I would seek unanimous consent of the committee that Mr. Pompeo, who's on the full committee but not on the Health Subcommittee, be able to sit with us today in this hearing. Without objections so ordered, I'd like to welcome all of our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to your testimony. And at this time, I yield 5 minutes to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Pitts. Today's topic warrants the thoughtful consideration of this committee. Many Americans are interested in the regulation and labeling of foods with genetically modified ingredients, and while it is an emotional issue for many, the facts can lead reasonable people to different conclusions. For policymakers, there are a number of considerations involved, so I'm glad that we're able to convene a panel to share the range of perspectives on the issues, and I hope we can engage in an honest and respectful discussion. Genetically modified foods have been in our food supply for decades. In fact, some estimate that over 70% of processed foods contain GMOs. However, they are not labeled as such. In the wake of growing concerns from consumers, the Food and Drug Administration issued a policy statement on its regulatory oversight and labeling policies for GM foods in 1992, and in 2001 issued draft guidance on voluntary industry labeling. I fully understand why consumers want to know what goes into the food they serve their families. For people to make informed decisions about what they eat, they need information. And that's why we required food labels to include nutrition facts, and it's why they must use common rather than technical names for ingredients whenever possible, so that this information is in fact useful. It's also why several states have enacted their own regulations mandating the labeling of these foods. 3 states have put new laws on their books, while many more have considered doing so, either through ballot initiative or state legislation. None of the state labeling laws have gone into effect yet. While such laws give voice to the many who are concerned, I'm troubled by the net effect of the inconsistent state standards. America's agricultural production and food distribution chains necessarily cross state lines, and conflicting regulations could cause difficulties resulting in higher costs for consumers. Like the advances in medical technology that we deal with as a subcommittee, innovations in biotechnology have the real potential to address current problems and improve the quality of life for people across the globe. Yet as representatives of the American people, we must also be sure that the application of these technologies does not put consumers at risk, and that information is available for those seeking it out. In the end, science must remain the arbiter of any safety concerns, and our regulations must reflect a rigorous evaluation of the evidence. So again, I'm glad that we're having this hearing. I look forward to the panel's testimony. I hope that we can weigh the merits of all recommendations presented and evaluate just how any regulatory approach would best serve the interests of the American people. I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone, for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your kind words, and thank all of you for coming today. Mr. Chairman, access to safe and affordable food is very important to every consumer in America. I think at least we can agree on that fact. I begin this conversation by saying that I represent an agricultural district in North Carolina. It is also a low-income district, and so I have a very keen interest in this subject. A large portion of my North Carolina district is agriculture. Farmers all across my state and across my district remind me that North Carolina farmers don't just grow crops for North Carolinians. They grow crops for America. And so the food supply chain is vast. It's interconnected. The work necessary to get an apple or an ear of corn to the produce section at the supermarket is absolutely staggering. From seed to farmer to wholesaler to processor to packer to distributor, even to the store shelf itself. It's easy to appreciate the intricate system that feeds America, and I'm beginning to learn more and more about this. But several states have proposed regulations and that I worry, if enacted, would cause significant disruption to the nation's food supply. It would cause confusion, it would cause uncertainty among consumers, and ultimately will result in increased cost at the checkout line. Depending on what the state regulations mandate, separate supply chains will likely have to be developed beginning at the farm and at every step all the way to the supermarket. The new infrastructure requirements are as daunting as they are costly, and you can bet that all of those costs will be passed on to the consumer, with studies showing that the average cost topping $500 a year. For many of my constituents, that would be impossible. So I've worked with my friend Mr. Pompeo and others to propose what I believe is a measured approach that gives consumers certainty while taking into account the delicate balance and sheer size and complexity of the food supply chain that employs many Americans. The proposal, my friends, is very simple. The FDA, our nation's foremost food safety authority, should have the authority to require labeling on genetically modified foods and establish federal standards so that consumers, regardless of where they live or work, will clearly understand the options. Finally, I will say, Mr. Chairman, that I will be the first to say that this proposal is not perfect. This proposal is not perfect. It will certainly evolve as it progresses. We don't legislate in a vacuum, but I believe a national labeling standard makes the most sense for our highly integrated and interdependent food supply. I'm confident that we will take what we learned from today's hearing, as well as the input we are sure to receive, to inform our work as we move forward. We need common sense legislation. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the Vice Chairman of the full committee, gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The people who are going to be harmed the most by the anti-GMO activist movement are those who can least fight against it. For example, there is a rice, it's called golden rice, which was developed with genetic engineering. One of the benefits to this rice, and the reason that it is called golden rice, is that it has a level of vitamin A that is not found in other rice. Golden rice has fed millions of starving people around the world and additionally prevented blindness and death because of the presence of vitamin A. The rice has been shown to be safe by multiple tests, and yet the anti-GMO activists have opposed its use, simply because they do not like the idea of genetically modified food. Farmers have genetically modified food for centuries. Farmers would breed cattle to get the best traits. Crops were developed which are most resistant to drought, pest, and weeds. George Washington Carver did research and taught at Tuskegee for over 40 years. While there, he developed techniques to improve soil, give farmers alternative cash crops, improve the nutrition of people living in the South. He did this by experimenting with different varieties of peanuts and sweet potatoes. Of course, different varieties are simply products with different genetic makeup. To bring reason to this discussion of different varieties of food, my colleagues and I have introduced legislation. H.R. 4432, the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act of 2014, introduced by Rep. Pompeo and myself, along with Reps. Matheson and Whitfield, would prohibit genetically modified plants intended for food use to be sold without first complying with the safety review process at the FDA. Under this bill, if the FDA were to find a difference between the new product and the comparable non-GMO food that might affect safety, the FDA would require a label. The bill would do the following. Number one, advance food safety, address the questions that consumers have about the safety of GMO food by requiring the FDA to conduct a safety review of all new GMO traits before they're introduced to the marketplace. Number two, inform consumers. Help consumers make sense of GMO labeling claims and their choices in the marketplace by asking the FDA to establish federal standards for companies that want to voluntarily label their product for the absence of or the presence of GMO food ingredients. Number three, provide consistency. Improve food labels using the term natural by requiring FDA to define the term for its use on food and beverage products, thus creating a consistent legal framework to guide food labels and inform consumer choice. Fourth, eliminate confusion, which is what all good legislation should do, and remove the uncertainty of the 50-state patchwork. Thank you for holding the hearing, and at this time, I yield my remaining time to Mr. Pompeo.
Thank you for yielding, Ms. Blackburn. Thank you to you and to Mr. Butterfield for being co-sponsors of this bill. You can see today that we are engaged in a bipartisan effort to get to the facts and the science surrounding this incredibly important issue. I want to thank all the witnesses for coming. I especially want to thank Stacy Forshee, fellow Kansan. It's your second trip to Washington to help do good work on behalf of consumers all across the country. Thank you for being here today. Look, at the end of the day, this is a bill that is needed to make sure that folks all across America can afford food. We in America have known for a long time that absent innovation and technology, the food prices will rise dramatically. We won't be able to feed the next billion people in the world either, something that I think we take great pride in here in America. Studies have shown that absent this legislation, the average family's food bill will go up by $500. And while I know there's for some for whom that's not a lot of money, there are a lot of folks that I represent for whom that is an awful lot of money, and who are living day to day and paycheck to paycheck, and who care deeply to make sure that their food prices, one of the things that they have to make hard decisions about from time to time, doesn't get even more difficult in this economy that we know is struggling so much. And it's also to help folks who are the producers of this food, to make sure that they have a way to get this product from their cattle ranch or their farm or wherever it may be to our store shelves in a way that they can do profitably, so that they can continue to invest in their products, so that America continues to be the leader in world production of food at an affordable way. You know, the science is not debatable here. There's been lots of research, lots of studies. Even those who oppose this bill don't make much of a case about the science. And that's what FDA is all about. It's about getting the science right. This bill gives them the opportunity to continue to review that. And I think it's really good policy and will make our food supply chain enviable all around the world. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman. 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is on a topic about which many Americans have strong feelings. 20 years ago, the first genetically engineered food, the slow-ripening flavor-saver tomato, went on the market. Today, the vast majority of corn and soybeans and cotton and canola and sugar beets and papaya grown in the U.S. are genetically engineered. All of these foods have been assessed by the Food and Drug Administration in a voluntary consultation process, and FDA has found no significant differences between them and their traditionally bred counterparts. Some 70 to 80% of packaged foods contain ingredients from genetically engineered or GE plants. Yet despite their ubiquity and FDA's okay, many consumers remain uncomfortable with these foods and want mandatory labeling so they can avoid them. As we consider the questions on GE foods at today's hearing, I will examine them in the context of some important principles I have long supported. First, I believe it is critical that our actions be based on science. As with so many other matters pertaining to products we use and consume every day, we need to rely on the expertise of FDA and other scientific regulatory agencies. Second, when we consider requiring labeling on food, that label should provide useful science-based information to consumers. I certainly believe that food labels should enable consumers to make informed choices. I fought hard to pass legislation that gave consumers useful information about the nutritional content of food. Third, unless there is a compelling policy reason otherwise, we should maintain the ability of states to make a decision that is different from the federal government. All three of these concepts are at play here today, and I think we should examine each carefully. On the first concept, what does the science tell us about GE foods? From what I understand, genetic engineering is not an inherently dangerous technology. Certainly when it is used to give new properties to plants, we need to make sure those new properties don't affect the safety or nutrition of food from those plants. But if FDA has done that and finds that GE food does not differ in any significant way from traditional food, why should there be a label that marks it as different? If there are safety questions about a food, then it shouldn't be allowed on the market at all. I look forward to hearing more from FDA and other witnesses on this today. Nevertheless, I understand that people may still want information about how their foods are produced. So let's look at the second concept of whether there is a way to give them meaningful and useful science-based information. On the one hand, I'm concerned that people have the information they want or need. On the other hand, I'm concerned that mandatory GE labeling could be inherently misleading. Mandatory labeling could lead consumers to believe that if the government is requiring a GE label, it must mean that GE foods are riskier or somehow fundamentally different from non-GE foods, and to date, scientists have concluded that they are not. Furthermore, given that up to 80% of packaged foods contain GE ingredients, if we require labels, most food on the shelves would have a label declaring the presence of GE ingredients. I'm not sure what good that does us. Under our current system, if consumers want to avoid GE foods, they can. They can buy organic foods, which by law cannot contain GE ingredients. Or they can search out the foods that manufacturers have certified and labeled as non-GE. That more targeted information may in fact be more usable, and I'd like to hear what our witnesses think about that. Now let's turn to the third principle of preserving the ability of states to make decisions that are right for their citizens, absent a compelling policy reason to the contrary. Even if there is not a compelling reason to require GE labeling at the federal level, that doesn't necessarily mean Congress should tell Vermont and other states that they cannot require such labeling. I've always believed states should have the right to act in the best interest of their residents. And I want to hear from our industry witnesses why the Vermont legislation and potentially similar legislation in other states is so harmful to some legitimate public interest that Congress should override them. Absent a compelling reason otherwise, I support letting states make their own laws and govern themselves. I remain open to hearing the views of all of our witnesses today on these 3 points and any other points pertaining to this issue. I think today's hearing will be very interesting and informative, and I thank the chairman for holding it.
Chair thanks the gentleman. That concludes the opening statements of the members. As always, the written opening statements of the members will be made a part of the record. I have a unanimous consent request here, a statement from the Corn Refiners Association to enter into the record without objection, so ordered. We have 2 panels today, and I'd like to call our first panel, and I'll introduce him at this time. We have Mr. Michael Landa, Director, Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Thank you for coming today. You will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. Your written testimony will be placed into the record. So at this point, Mr. Landa, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your summary.
Good morning, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Michael M. Landa, Director of the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition at the Food and Drug Administration. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss FDA's regulatory program for genetically engineered, or GE, foods. Over the last 20 years, FDA has reviewed data and information on more than 150 plant-derived GE foods. These range from herbicide-tolerant soybeans to canola oil with a modified fatty acid profile. Based on our evaluations, we are confident that the GE foods in the U.S. marketplace today are as safe as their conventionally bred counterparts. The selection and genetic improvement of plants for agricultural use has been going on for thousands of years.
Could you pull the mic a little closer to you, please?
Oh, sorry.
Yep, thank you.
That better?
That's better, thank you.
Typically, plant breeding has involved crossbreeding and hybridization. Many of the foods that are already common in our diet, such as hybrid corn or nectarines, are obtained from plant varieties that were developed using such conventional genetic techniques. But during the breeding process, undesirable traits, such as poor yield or poor disease resistance, may appear. These unwanted traits can often be eliminated through additional breeding and selective reproduction, but the process is painstaking and time-consuming. Today, by inserting one or more specific genes into a plant, scientists are able to produce a plant with new, advantageous characteristics. These techniques give scientists the ability to isolate specific genes of interest and introduce them and their corresponding traits into plants without introducing undesirable genes or traits. This important improvement over traditional plant breeding can reduce the time needed to develop a new variety and expand the range of new proteins and other substances that can be introduced into plants. Any of these genetic modification techniques has the potential to change the composition of food in a manner relevant to food safety. FDA, however, has well-established scientific procedures for evaluating the safety of new foods, including any new substances in food, and our guidelines help developers address any safety concerns prior to marketing. FDA regulates the safety of all foods, including those derived from GE plants, under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which we call the Food and Drug Act. Foods developed from genetically engineered plant varieties, such as fruits, vegetables, grains, and their byproducts, are subject to the same safety requirements as foods derived from non-GE plants. The agency relies primarily on two sections of the Food and Drug Act to ensure the safety of food and food ingredients produced by genetic engineering: the adulteration provisions in Section 402 of the Food and Drug Act and the food additive provisions in Section 409. Food growers, manufacturers, and distributors are responsible for taking the steps necessary to ensure that their food products are safe. The law places primary responsibility for ensuring safety of food on industry. But to help developers of food derived from GE plants comply with their obligations under the Food and Drug Act and FDA's regulations, the agency encourages them to participate in a voluntary consultation process prior to commercial distribution. Since the process was created, developers of GE plants have completed the process more than 100 times as they sought to introduce plants into the U.S. market. Typically, the consultation begins early in development when the agency advises the company on what tests would be appropriate to assess the safety of the new food. After the studies are completed, a summary of the data reflecting safety and nutritional assessment are provided to FDA for its review. FDA expects developers of GE foods to analyze the composition of the foods from their new crop varieties to ensure that any changes compared to the food's conventionally derived counterpart are appropriately considered and addressed before marketing such foods. As part of our review and analysis, we consider whether any newly introduced protein is likely to be allergenic or toxic, and whether levels of important nutrients or anti-nutrients have been changed in a way that is important to food safety or nutrition. We also consider whether any newly introduced protein requires pre-market approval as a food additive. Examples of the information evaluated by FDA include the name of the food and the crop from which it's derived, the source, identities, functions, and stability of introduced genetic material, the purpose of the modification and its expected effect on the composition and characteristics of the food, the identity and function of any new substances introduced by the genetic material, a comparison of the composition and characteristics of the GE food to that of food derived from the parental variety, and information on whether the genetic modification altered the allergic or toxic potential of the food. Let me just speak for a minute or so about FDA regulation of labeling. We regulate labeling, including labeling of GE foods, under the Food and Drug Act and our regulations. The Act establishes that a food is misbranded if its labeling is false or misleading in any particular. The Act also provides that labeling is misleading if it, 1, fails to reveal material facts that are material with respect to representations made or suggested in the labeling, or 2, fails to reveal facts that are material with respect to consequences that may result from use of the food, whether that's a labeled use or a customary use. Historically, FDA has taken the position that the use of genetic engineering in the development of a food is normally not, by itself, material information within the meaning of the Food and Drug Act. Federal courts have held that absent a material fact or a difference in food derived from a GE source, the Act does not require labeling indicating that the food has been developed through genetic engineering. In closing, let me reiterate that the consultation process for foods derived from GE plants is working well and provides for a rigorous food safety evaluation of such foods. The agency will continue to be vigilant in ensuring the safety and integrity of the food supply. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you
Chair, thanks to the gentleman. We'll now begin questioning. I'll recognize myself 5 minutes for that purpose. Mr. Landa, you state in your testimony that FDA has reviewed and evaluated data and information on over 150 genetically engineered foods. Based on these reviews and the data that has been compiled over the past 20 years, is the agency more or less confident today in the safety of the underlying technology?
I think its confidence remains strong. It has been and remains strong.
How do you know that genetically engineered foods are no different in terms of safety than their conventional counterparts?
Well, we know this based on the reviews we conduct. When we're looking at the genetic material, we're looking at products of that material, new proteins, for example, at their safety. We look at toxicity, potential toxicity, allergenicity. We look at chemical composition to see whether it's different from the conventional counterpart. We look at the safety of the whole food, if you will. And we look to see whether there are any differences in nutrients that might require disclosure, for example.
How long typically does your evaluation take?
I will have to get back to you with detailed information, if I may.
All right. Are there any material differences between genetically engineered ingredients and those derived from traditionally bred crops?
In general, no. We have found that there have not been such differences.
Does the FDA support the various state legislative and ballot measures that would require the labeling of genetically engineered foods, or would these initiatives interfere with FDA's authority over food production or labeling?
We haven't reviewed the initiatives, don't have any view about them, and therefore we don't know whether they'd interfere or not.
Would state-specific labeling requirements change anything as far as your evaluation is concerned?
I do not believe so.
All right. Let me ask if there currently is a lack of consensus about the validity of the research and science behind the safety of foods derived from genetically engineered plant varieties.
I think there is not. That is, I think there is a consensus.
There is a consensus in the scientific community. All right. This time I will recognize Mr. Pallone, 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Landa, some who oppose mandatory GE labeling argue that such labeling would be inherently misleading. They argue that such a requirement would easily be taken to imply that the government considered food from GE plants to be so fundamentally different from food from non-GE plants as to warrant a special designation. And I guess I agree that if the GE designation had to look like a warning, it would be misleading. However, in the next panel, Mr. Faber testifies that his organization is not asking for anything like a warning label, but rather a modest disclosure on the back of the package. And I guess I'd like to get your view, based on your experience with food labeling, whether it would be possible to design the size and wording of a mandatory GE designation in such a way as to be innocuous. In other words, those who look for it could find it. Those who don't care about genetic engineering would have no reason to pay attention to it. I'm not asking whether FDA could require such a label, nor whether you think any form of mandatory GE labeling would be appropriate from a scientific perspective. Just that if Congress were to decide that the best way to avoid multiple state GE labeling requirements would be to impose a federal GE labeling requirement, do you think it would be possible to do so in a way that would be neutral and would not tarnish the product? And also, as part of your answer, if you could describe FDA's experience with irradiation labeling and whether we could learn from that experience.
I certainly have not thought about the question you posed with respect to the nature of a statement about GE labeling. I don't think the agency has considered that question because our focus has been on whether there is a difference.
The material definition.
Allowing us to require disclosure. I think one way of looking at that question is whether there are data on similar efforts, or whether one could design a study to answer that question, so that people would look at different formulations of labeling, and you would learn what they would take away from those different formulations.
I mean, the reason I asked the question, I know I guess you don't really feel you can answer at this point, is because, you know, a lot of people that approach me that would like the labeling requirement don't necessarily make the argument that there's a scientific difference, but just that they should, or that it's bad, but just that they should know.
No, I understand. I mean, but one might, for example, again, I think maybe one could develop different formulations and do experimental studies surrounding them. These are types of studies that are typically done over the internet with panels that are set up. They're large numbers, to see what people would take away from a different mock label.
Okay. Now, I know you say that the FDA's consultation process is right now is obviously voluntary, but what does that mean in practice? In other words, if it's voluntary, why would companies choose to use it? Do you have an estimate of how many manufacturers choose not to use it? In other words, what's the pros and cons of this voluntary approach?
We think for people intending to commercialize product, we think those people do come to us for several reasons. I mean, one, there's the basic statutory requirement on companies to market food that is safe. Another is that we learn a great deal from EPA and from APHIS and from others about what is going on in this area, which is another incentive for people also to come to us. And finally, we think that growers are going to be reluctant to use seeds where there isn't a sort of a no questions letter from us, because if at the end of that growing season they have a crop that turns out to be either unlawful or unmarketable because questions have arisen, better to start with a product that's been through the consultation process. So we think there are lots of drivers that make the voluntary process one people do subscribe to, at least people who are intending to commercialize.
Now, you say that the FDA hasn't required the genetically engineered label because they don't believe the information is material. Does FDA have the authority under the Act to change its assessment that information is not material? Do you think you have the authority to do that?
Yes, certainly in a given case. And let me also say, the policy I've been describing, we've been discussing, has been in place for roughly 20 years, but we have been asked to change it. We have before us several citizen petitions asking to change our view on the law with respect to materiality and asking us to change our view with respect, in some cases, I think, to the facts. And we're considering those petitions. We haven't responded yet, but we certainly have the authority to change a position as long as the change is appropriately grounded in the science and an interpretation of the law.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now I recognize the Vice Chairman of the full committee, Ms. Blackburn. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Landa, thank you so much for your time. I have to tell you, I find this an absolutely fascinating debate, and am so appreciative that you would take the time and the FDA would take the time to talk with us on it. I grew up in South Mississippi with a grandmother who, when she went to college at the turn of the century, the 19th century, chose to audit agriculture classes. So then buying a farm and with her savings from being a teacher, and married. She has 5 boys from, and then my mother, 5 more boys. Big farm. During the Depression, she helps feed our hometown. So being someone who enjoys growing things, as I was, and very active in 4-H club, which I was, and going on to be a part of a crop judging team, I learned to appreciate what goes into having good-looking food, because we eat with our eyes. I also grew to appreciate yield per acre that I would learn from my grandmother, and having foods that would be more drought resistant, that would take less chemicals, that would take less pesticides, things of that nature, and the importance of that so that you had a good looking and good tasting food product that did not as readily and easily spoil. So I come to this debate from that background. And today, even in my district, I visit a lot of the farmers markets. And every once in a while, someone will come up and talk about genetically engineered food or genetically modified food. And I enjoy asking them what that means to them. And I have found it so fascinating that it means something different to nearly everyone that I talk to, because we don't have that federal standard, if you will. And I hope that you all at the FDA are going to be able to work with us on this. Basically, everything we eat is genetically modified, whether it's corn or wheat or any variety of tomatoes, which were mentioned earlier. It all has been genetically modified. If you want to go back and eat original wheat or barley, it's not going to give you very much of a yield. And it's not going to be the desirable product that you're looking for today. So we have to realize that as a part of this debate. So moving forward, let's go back to Mr. Pallone's question on the labeling. I'd love to hear from you what you all at the FDA, what your team thinks should be conveyed in those labels to the consumer. What should be there about health, about safety, and about nutritional content of those products?
Well, the statute tells us as a general matter that labeling is not to be false or misleading. That's sort of the basic proposition. And since then, there have been many changes to law, including NLEA, which has directed us to write the nutrition facts label, the nutrition facts panel, which has information about macronutrients and micronutrients. In fact, we are in the process now of updating that label. We proposed earlier this year to do that, and we're reviewing comments on it.
And when do you anticipate having those recommendations?
I would certainly hope that the agency could issue final rules updating nutrition facts by 2016. It's a complicated, it's called informal rulemaking, which is less difficult than formal rulemaking, but it is still a very resource-intensive
I'm
process.
about to run out of time. I want to get to a couple of other things. I'm certain you all go through reams of information on analyzing data on the GE foods, and I wonder how often do your FDA analysts go back in and request additional information when you have a submission?
I don't know. I can't answer that, but we will get that information for you.
Okay, does the FDA distinguish foods based on the method of breeding or the material composition of the food?
Not for labeling purposes unless there's a material fact.
Okay. Are you satisfied that your agency is capable of understanding genetic engineering and determining whether or not a plant is safe?
Yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Landa, in many of the articles on GE Foods, people claim that the science is unsettled, controversial, or new, with the implication that there may be unknown risks, and therefore consumers are justified in being uneasy with GE Foods. And yet, from your testimony, we get a different impression. However, while you point out that genetic engineering is just one of many techniques used in plant breeding, I don't think FDA has a consultation process for any of the others. How new is the science behind GE Foods, and what are the risks from them? And if genetic engineering is not especially risky, why do you encourage companies to go through your consultation process prior to marketing foods from GE plants?
I think it's largely there certainly is some possibility of, for example, of a material difference. I think we identified one with a product where there wasn't a safety issue, but there was a difference in how the food performed in the consumer's hands. I think it had to do with friability. And we have completed over 100 consultations. There have been a handful that have not gone to completion, where we were asked to stop the review, or the submitter withdrew. I think in general the process, which has been in place for some time, was one that enabled us to learn and also to build confidence, and we would hope to transmit some confidence in this technology.
Is this a new area of science?
No, I mean certainly it's decades old.
As you know, many consumers believe they have a right to know whether a food was manufactured using genetically engineered ingredients, irrespective of all the science in the world showing them to be no different from non-GE ingredients. I'd like to understand more about such a requirement and how it would fit in with FDA's traditional stance toward labeling requirements if Congress were to respond to this consumer demand and pass a law requiring the labeling of genetically engineered foods. How would mandatory labeling of genetically engineered foods compare with existing labeling requirements, such as to reveal the presence of allergens in a food, or that a food has been irradiated? Would FDA be concerned about a new law that requires the labeling of GE foods, and if so, why?
There isn't any administration position on such legislation. It would be obviously new for us. We would implement it as best we could. I suppose the question it would raise would be, what is sort of the limiting principle? If what animates this is right to know, the question then becomes, what is it that people do not have a right to know on the food label? And I'm not sure how one answers that question.
There's just some foods that are irradiated. Why would anybody irradiate their food? Why would a manufacturer want to irradiate food?
For safety reasons.
To keep the food from spoiling?
Spices are irradiated, for example.
Okay. Now, is there any harm from that? Any consequences that are problematic?
No.
Yet we require labeling. Why do we require labeling on foods that have been irradiated?
It has been thought that irradiation could, as a process, could change some properties of the food, and also as and so that was the thinking behind that.
But there's no evidence of that.
I'd have to go look at the time, what we said at the time we issued the labeling requirement.
Now, why is this any different? You don't think there's a problem. You said there may be a problem, but you don't know of a problem. What's the difference between informing people that their spices have been irradiated, if they want to know that information, even though you don't think it's particularly helpful for them to know it?
I think, as I said, I think at the time with irradiation, we thought that there was a possibility of a change in characteristics of the food which people would not know about. We do not think that is the case with genetic engineering.
Do you think we should remove the labels from irradiated foods?
The agency has issued a proposal to do that. It has not finalized it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. The question I have is, I understand the state debate, but do you know of any state that has the capability to do the research and the findings to the same standard as the FDA?
I don't, but I wouldn't have any reason to know that one way.
Yeah, I can tell you, I'm from a big state of Illinois, and we can't do it. There may be one, maybe California has some capability, but my guess is smaller states, they don't have nearly the ability to do the research that you all do. And I think that's part of this whole, should states be able to have their own labeling restrictions and requirements, because as we found, it's really based upon emotion and not based upon a scientific evaluation. Let me ask about, do you distinguish foods based upon the method of breeding or the material composition of the food?
We don't require labeling based on method of production alone.
Why not?
Because we have found that it is not material to safety or nutritional composition.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Let me, in the case of sugar, right? We sugar processors require to label whether refined table sugar comes from I guess the question is, are sugar processors required to label whether refined table sugar comes from a certain species or plant?
I'm sorry, I don't.
So if you got, you don't require fine table sugar to label whether it comes from sugar beets or from cane?
No.
Why?
Again, I think it's a question of materiality to safety or nutritional composition.
If we were, would the consumers would they get any benefit if that labeling requirement for fine table sugar also had a requirement, well, this is beet produced fine table sugar or sugar cane fine table sugar?
Again, what we focus on is the attribute of the food as the consumer would eat it.
For the genetically engineered ingredients in foods today, is there any evidence that they vary in their objective characteristics in any meaningful or uniform way?
No, not as a class.
Can you explain why FDA's regulatory focus is on the food or food product as opposed to the process in which it was grown?
Because, of course, in the end, it's the food that we eat.
Right. Yeah, and I appreciate it. I think you're going to keep getting the same questions from members here on trying to understand. You are Food and Drug Administration. You all come before us on a lot of different aspects. You are our trusted advisors. We respect the job that you do. I know this is a very difficult and emotional debate for some folks on both sides because it deals with some individual consumers. It deals with the agricultural community that many of us represent. We have to have an impartial, observer based upon health and safety effects to the consuming public. We appreciate the work you do. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Landa, for your appearance here with us today, your testimony. I understand that FDA's position that under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the breeding methods by which a plant was developed is not material information about food from that plant. However, in their testimony, Mr. Faber and Representative Webb point out that many consumers do believe that foods labeled as natural, in quotes, natural, are not genetically engineered and sometimes buy such foods because of that belief. They also say that many such foods do contain GE ingredients. I can understand FDA's reluctance to wade into the argument as to what constitutes natural. But if many consumers believe that the term natural implies non-GE and make purchasing choices based on that belief, shouldn't the use of that term on a food label be considered a representation that the food is in fact non-GE? I know that's kind of a packed question. I'm going to continue just for a little bit more, give you plenty to deal with. It's my only question, actually. And if so, wouldn't the use of the term natural on a food containing GE ingredients be, as the statute says, failing to reveal facts and material in light of such representation if it does not state that it contains GE ingredients? It gets convoluted. In other words, and this is the question, even though the use of genetic engineering may not be material information per se, doesn't it become material information in those circumstances in which the rest of the labeling of the GE food implies that the food does not contain GE ingredients? If you can sort that out, kudos to you. But this is the topic I wish to hear from you. And take your time because for the next few minutes.
There is a short answer to this, which is that we have pending several citizen petitions related to the question of what is natural, including one going to the very question I think you're getting at, which is a food that contains a genetically engineered ingredient or ingredient derived from a genetically engineered plant, a food that may properly be labeled as natural. There's a great debate about that. We have been petitioned to say yes. I'm sure we've been petitioned to say no. We've been petitioned to establish a definition for natural, and we are considering those petitions. It's really all I can say at the moment.
Is there any? Can you shed any light on this topic for the sake of our constituents as to where you are going? And I mean, I agree. It's very confusing.
Well, one possibility, we have not committed to this, but to take you back a little bit, the agency embarked on an effort to define natural years ago. That did not result in a codified definition. It resulted in a statement in the preamble that natural can't be either added or synthetic, I think was the language. We have been asked on many occasions to develop a definition. I personally have been asked on many occasions. I've always said we really don't have the resources to do that. We now have petitions before us. I think if we decide to reconsider this issue, there will necessarily have to be a public process. Whether we would embark on rulemaking, which has to be a public process, or guidance, there will be some public process if we decide to revisit this.
Well, I actually applaud that. I think the public is already engaged. I believe that, and would be a welcoming, this is my opinion now, but from what my constituents are telling me, that they are already engaged, and a signal from FDA that maybe you don't have black and white kind of answers to give, that you are seriously considering this, and maybe that we can carry on this kind of conversation throughout the country. It appears to me that consumers are clearly confused by the current labeling system. I mean, we can perhaps all agree on that. It's complicated today. And they're making purchasing decisions based on sometimes, I believe, misleading or unclear labeling. And I'm not blaming necessarily here, but it leads to a state of confusion. And I hope that you can find the resources in FDA to take a broader look at what is happening with respect to consumers' experiences, so that they can have confidence in this system that we have, and work with you to strengthen the labeling system to reduce the kind of confusion that we're talking about. With that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, thanks, gentlelady. And now I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, I eat a fair number of odd foods, and a number of those are labeled non-GMO. Is there a distinction between genetically modified and genetically engineered?
I think as a technical matter, GMO refers to an organism as opposed to genetic engineering, which we think of as having to do with sort of modern biotechnology.
Okay. In that regard, one of the concerns that I have, and I want to know if it's a concern for you, is that I come from a family where just about half of us have some kind of food allergy. If you're changing proteins around and you have things that are, for the general public, recognized as safe, generally recognized as safe, are you able, in what you all do, to be able to distinguish if a protein that someone may be allergic to has been added to a product which they may not know that protein's just been included?
That is the part of the evaluation process. And if there were to be an addition that might prompt an allergic reaction that one would not expect, we would require a label disclosure.
So you'd pick out those things which people are highly allergic to, or which there's a significant percentage of folks that have a problem with, and you say, okay, you can't put the strawberry ingredient into this.
Or we would require disclosure.
Or disclosure.
Most likely would be the.
And I apologize if I missed this in one of your earlier answers. Are you all looking at the possibility of for those people who may be concerned, saying or labeling a product as something that is in fact, as opposed to saying it is genetically engineered or genetically modified in some way, having those companies that want to, obviously you pay more for it, but have some process where they can actually say, we've used all products that are not genetically engineered or modified?
We've had guidance, draft guidance, since about 2001 on voluntary labeling. So there isn't any prohibition on a voluntary label that your food does not contain G ingredients. So the basic requirement is that statement not be false or misleading.
Okay, and I appreciate that. You indicated earlier that it was pretty much a consensus that this was not something that was dangerous, if I understood your testimony correctly. And yet I know there are a number of countries around the world that have concerns about products and sometimes will ban our exports if they think that there's been some cross-pollination or something. Can you explain why they're concerned?
I think different countries have different regulatory systems. There are obviously different cultures with different attitudes towards different aspects of foods, from production to consumption to preparation and everything else. And I think that.
Other than culture, have any of those countries had studies that indicated there was some danger to the human, general human?
Not to my knowledge, no.
All right, I appreciate that. And I think you said earlier you're looking at finalizing some guidance about 2016.
The nutrition facts.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
All right. And I'm going to switch just briefly because we've got a little bit of time left into a different subject, but it is tangentially related, and that is, what do you do about the grocery stores that are fixing food and selling things, and they've got to do nutrition facts, and then you get into the whole allergens and then the GE or GMO foods. How do you deal with all of that as a part for grocery stores?
I mean, the processed food is subject to nutrition facts.
Right.
What we have called restaurant type food made and sold in a grocery store is now subject, or will be when it becomes effective, to menu labeling requirements.
I think, I would just tell you, I think that even though I'm concerned about it and I might not eat the food if I didn't know what was in it, I'm not sure how a grocery store is going to be able to comply with that when they may be using all kinds of different ingredients and somebody walks up and says, can I have X, Y, or Z? It may be easier for, like a McDonald's, where they've got certain ingredients and every one of them has a label. The grocery store may not have that capability.
Well, we're talking about standard menu items, so I think...
Standard menu items. So if it's some kind of specialty item, they would have an exemption?
Yeah, again, the requirement is establish 20 or more establishments, or restaurants, and similar retail establishments is the language in the statute, and it's standard menu items.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentleman, Mr. Butterfield, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just remark on the statement made by Ms. Blackburn a few minutes ago about this being a fascinating debate, Mr. Chairman. This is certainly a fascinating debate by any measure. In my former life, I served as a trial judge down in North Carolina, and every day for 15 years I had to look at the evidence and had to decide the facts. That was my job description, and I did it for 15 years. And I've tried to do that in this debate, and I've read large amounts of well-informed publications over the last several months. And I, for one, I'm just convinced that GE plants are as safe as any other foods. But Mr. Lander, I need to interpose this question to you. Do you have any evidence that foods derived from GE plants are as safe as other foods? I've heard you mention it throughout your testimony, but is there any scintilla of evidence that would suggest that these foods are unsafe?
I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Is there any evidence that suggests that these foods are unsafe?
Yes, yes. The GE foods are unsafe.
Not to our knowledge, no.
All right. And how large is your agency, and how large is the division that handles this task?
Well, the office that handles that task has maybe 135 or 140 people, but certainly not all of those people handle a variety of tasks related to food additives, generally recognized as safe substances.
But these are not politicians. These are career employees at your agency.
Correct.
Yeah. Have you encountered anyone who advocates a 50-state approach to mandatory labeling?
I'm not sure I understand.
I mean, you've talked to a lot of people, both formally and informally, about this. And
anyone who advocates that we have 50 separate
sets of regulations plus the District of Columbia.
I have not.
I happen to find
I have any reason to encounter such a person, but
it seems to me illogical and irrational. But I'm wrong from time to time. But I don't see how that would ever work, even in California. I yield back.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to sort out the science here. I have lots of passionate constituents who are very concerned about GE products. I have experts that we'll hear on the next panel who have great scientific credentials themselves, who will argue about consumer information being provided about GE products. I want to follow up on another word. Ms. Capps was talking about natural. I want to ask you about material difference. You said that the FDA could change his view that GE status of food is not material, which it is. That's the position right now. There's no material difference. and that the agency is evaluating citizens' petitions that report to do that. So can you elaborate on why the FDA has not believed this is a material difference, and what, have the courts said anything about it? What kind of different information might change your mind?
Well, we haven't found any differences in relation to safety or nutritional composition, or, I mean, again, as considering these foods as a class, any differences in safety or nutritional composition or any other attribute of the food.
Can I ask you one thing? What about food allergies? Since we're putting in product into the DNA something from perhaps a peanut into something else.
In that case, we'd require disclosure. That would be material.
And would that prevent, in this consultation process, from that particular formulation going to market?
No. What would happen is there would be a disclosure of the allergic potential of the food. That would be a material fact.
Okay. And a seed that I know Mr. Pitt said you can use less pesticide. That's sometimes true, although the FDA has just approved use of a seed that would make it more tolerant of a lot more pesticide. Does the FDA have any concerns about that?
I'm not familiar with that matter. I'm sorry.
2,4-D and glyphosate. Anyway, okay. Well, so material, meaning even in the peanut issue, then a disclosure would be required because of safety?
Typically, with respect to allergens, yes, that's. I mean, first of all, there's a statute, a 2004 statute requires disclosure of the sort of we call the big 8 allergens. But if you were to find another allergen, you would typically we would require disclosure of it rather than ban the food.
And who does the research? I have to tell you, my constituents who are against GMOs will say Monsanto, DuPont, and, you know, can we really trust these companies that benefit so much?
The data that are supplied to us are supplied to us by the companies doing the consulting, and they will do, sometimes they will do the studies, sometimes they will pay to have the studies done. I will say that is true across all FDA-regulated products. FDA does research, but it does not do research on the scale that would be required to support voluntary submissions, much less marketing applications.
Let me ask one more question. Does the Food and Drug Administration have the authority to implement a mandatory pre-market approval process of any food to ensure that it's safe for consumers?
We proposed a number of years ago a mandatory notification program for the types of products we've been talking about this morning. That proposed rule is still in existence. We have not found the need to finalize it, given what we think is how well the voluntary program works. But that proposal necessarily maintained that we had the authority to establish a mandatory program.
And in the, I'll yield back. I can put some more questions in writing. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, General. Just for clarification, when you say it requires disclosure, does that mean
label
on a label?
On the label. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you for that question. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Gentleman, Mr. Matheson is recognized 5 minutes for question.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Land, I appreciate you coming here today. You just said this with Mr. Butterfield, but I just want to be clear. From the FDA perspective, to date, you've found no scientific evidence that there's a health and safety issue with genetically engineered foods.
That is correct.
Okay, I appreciate that. If there is this consumer demand for wanting to know, if there is a producer of a non-GMO food in the organic industry, they can label their product as such that it's non-GMO. Is that correct?
So long as the labeling is not false or misleading, that is correct.
So if the marketplace wants this, there is a private sector opportunity for the organic food industry to provide that information to consumers if they so choose.
That is correct.
Does the FDA have any regulatory authority over that type of labeling?
It's the general authority that labeling must not be false or misleading.
How long has the FDA been involved in managing food labeling?
Well, the provision, that the false or misleading provision, dates from either 1906 or 1938.
Long time.
I'm not sure which.
We'll stipulate it's a long time. And how is the FDA's role in terms of, if I'm in the food industry, and there are a lot of different people in it, how does the FDA's role give signals to the food industry for how they know how to do labeling? I mean, they look to you for guidance. They look to you for consistency. Is that correct?
Correct. They look to the statute. They look to regulations we issue. They look to guidance we issue. And they certainly, when they have particular questions, companies will call our experts in labeling.
So how do your guidances work? How do you come up with those labeling guidances, and how do they work?
Typically, on a significant issue, we would issue what's called a draft guidance. We would call for comment on it. We would analyze the comments we receive and issue it in final with or without changes, or perhaps decide not to issue it at all, or to reissue it with substantial changes and calling for more comment.
And the food industry relies on that. That's where they get their direction for how they do labeling, is from your guidances.
First the statute, then the regulations,
Gotcha.
and then guidance, yes.
How do food manufacturers, I want to address this issue about a national system versus a 50-state patchwork system. How do food manufacturers, from the big guys to the little guys, how do they benefit from a national system?
There's a benefit to uniformity, but I think the answer is that they're better positioned to tell you how much of a benefit that is to them than
How do
I am.
consumers benefit from a national system compared to 50 different sets of rules around our country?
You see the same labeling for the same product.
There you go. People do cross state lines, don't they?
Wherever you purchase it.
Yeah, it's funny how that works. I go 2,000 miles every week back and forth, yeah. So I think that I would suggest, not to answer for you, that you're going to confuse consumers if you have 50 different standards. That would be my suggestion. Let me ask you a question. How do you and the FDA resolve a situation if a product is mislabeled? What do you do if some manufacturer mislabels a product?
Typically, we might call the manufacturer. We might issue what's called a warning letter, depending on how serious we thought the infraction was. If the label were not corrected, ultimately we can, through the United States Department of Justice, seize the product that's misbranded because of a misleading label.
Right.
We can enjoin further distribution.
You've just defined, as the regulator in this industry for food labeling, you've just defined the tools in the toolbox you have to address situations that are mislabeled. That's what I suggest. You have been, the FDA, there have been claims by some consumer groups that the FDA is too closely aligned with the industry and it can't be trusted. How would you respond to that criticism?
I've been at FDA for almost 30 years. I work with people who've been there much longer, by the way. I believe, and my colleagues believe, that we are civil servants. We are engaged in an honorable profession and in an honorable activity. That does not mean we get every decision right any more than anyone on the planet gets every decision right, but we try to make decisions the best of our ability based on what the science tells us and based on the law and the regulations and sound policy.
Well, Mr. Land, I appreciate that answer, and I thank you for your civil service. I think there are a lot of folks in the agencies who are trying to do the right thing, and appreciate your forthrightness in these questions today. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Pallone for having a hearing today, and our witness for being here. Ensuring the safety of my constituents has always continued to be the top priority as a member of Congress, and I hope that your testimony today we can come to a greater understanding of the vital role that bioengineering plays in our food supply and the economy. Mr. Landa, thank you for taking your time to be here, and like our colleagues, we appreciate your 30 years of service to the FDA. I find this issue, as heated as it is, often leads to passionate claims. I hope your years of experience at the FDA can shed some light on the science of genetically modified organisms and the safety process behind their approval. How many new plants are reviewed by the FDA each year, and how much time does it take to conduct those reviews?
We'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay.
The number of completed reviews is about now, I think, 103. I think in 5 cases, submissions were withdrawn or people asked us to cease the review, but I can't. We'll have to get back to you on
Okay.
yearly figures and average times.
Okay. Do you believe changing from the voluntary reviews to mandatory reviews would change the number of reviews performed by the FDA each year?
I don't know, but I don't see why it would.
The coordinated framework was developed by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy to leverage the regulatory safety expertise present in the federal government agencies like the FDA. In the 30 years that the agency has been part of this, are you satisfied that your agency is capable of understanding genetic engineering and determining whether or not a plant is safe?
Yes.
Do you feel the FDA has the staff and capabilities to be the voice of authority when it comes to GMO safety?
In connection with foods in my center, yes.
Food safety. Do you feel that the coordinated framework requires adequate safeguards for consumer health and safety and gives companies the regulatory certainty they need to develop new products?
Yes.
Has a GMO plant been deemed unsafe in the past voluntary review process?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Has a GMO plant been deemed unsafe in the past voluntary review processes?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Was the safety issue due, if it was, if it hasn't been, but is it due to the genetic engineering, or is it other factors that you look for when you're inspecting it?
Again, I'm not aware of any consultation that has resulted in a finding of lack of safety. We have, the ones we have completed, we obviously have concluded we don't have any questions. There were a handful that did not go to completion. They were either withdrawn or we were asked to stop the review, and I simply don't know the details of sort of the reasons. But for
what happens when you're asked to stop the review?
We stop the review, and the products do not go to market.
Okay. So by just stopping the review, they don't go to market. Okay. So effectively, you're doing what a regulator is supposed to do. Was the framework rooted in congressional enactments like the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act? And do you feel that these statutes all, to some extent, preempt state requirements?
It varies enormously across statutes. I simply can't answer that question.
And each of these statutes, including the one from 1906, been instrumental in consumer protection?
I can speak to the Food and Drug Act. I think the answer to the question is yes. It dates from '06, was amended in '38, multiple times since then. I think in order to protect and promote the public health.
Do you have any suggestions on how we might look at some of these acts and make your job more effective? And you can get back to us if you want, because I know, but because that's our job. Is if you don't have the tools.
We're certainly happy to provide technical assistance whenever you ask us to do that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back my time.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Landa. this is kind of a random question, just picking up on your allergy discussion. Presumably, I mean, now you were suggesting that most ingredients to which there's an allergy of any significance, you require that be disclosed. Right?
Congress required it in 2004.
Okay. And, but FDA would determine at some point that if the number of people affected by that ingredient in terms of an allergy reached a certain percentage of the population or something, then it would flip into a banning of the ingredient. Like, sort of, where's that line? Just
no, it's not banning. It's a disclosure requirement. Disclosure in the labeling, as the chairman was reminding me earlier. So that if we were to conclude that a food ingredient that is not on the list in the 2004 statute that met a certain threshold, then I can't answer what that threshold is in terms of percentage of population. We would require disclosure of it on the label.
So you're talking about it meeting a certain threshold in terms of requiring disclosure. I'm asking you whether there's a threshold that one might meet that would suggest that
we would
ban it. I mean, if 95% of the population is allergic to a certain ingredient.
Of course. I mean,
okay.
Let me give you an example. The oldest adulteration provision in the law says, among other things, if a food bears or contains a substance that renders the food ordinarily injurious to health, the food's adulterated, and if it's adulterated, it's prohibited from interstate commerce. So sure, of course. I mean, if there was an ingredient that caused illness, and 90% of the population that would people who ate the food containing the ingredient, we would ban the ingredient. I'm sorry, I thought you were sort of trying to get at the disclosure question.
So let me switch. I'm curious about when industry has to go change labels in response to, say, some consultation exercise where everybody realizes that that's the right thing to do, or something more prescriptive that you require. Well, first of all, is it the case that these labels get created and they're sort of static for extended periods of time, or in your experience, is labeling constantly being revised and updated, both with respect to content potentially, but also just in terms of the form of it, the way it looks on packaging and all the rest?
I really don't know. Just not familiar enough with industry practice.
Can you,
that question?
In your 30 years, when was the last time that you can remember that something FDA did or some realization that the food industry came to resulted in a significant across-the-board change in labeling?
Well, the one that comes immediately to mind is nutrition facts, which is a regulation that's now the heart of it is now, I guess, about 20 years old. We required disclosure of trans fat.
8, so that was pretty significant.
8, 9, 10 years ago, where, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be revising nutrition facts. And
so if you revise what's required in the nutrition fact panel in this rulemaking period between now and 2016 or whatever it was, and you decide there's some additional things that ought to be in there, then that would cut across the entire food industry in a significant way in terms of revising its labels, right?
Correct.
Thank you.
Gentleman, time has expired. Chair recognizes gentleman, Mr. Pompeo, 5 minutes for questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Landa, for being here today. Thanks for your 30 years of service. I understand you're closer to the end of your service than the beginning at this point. And,
yes, thank you.
And thank you for your good work. Thanks for your testimony this morning, too. It's been interesting to watch. I think lots of folks watching this hearing this morning have been surprised by the certainty you're expressing around the science. You used the word initially that there's a consensus. I thought I'd try and parse into that just a little bit more. So when I've heard consensus, and that can be 70-30 or 80-20 or 90-10. Tell me how much science there is that would refute your position with respect to the materiality of genetically engineered foods being safe.
We do not believe, again, as a class, that there's any question about safety based on the reviews we've done.
And that would include go ahead.
There are obviously people, scientists, who differ with that point of view. I don't know how many of them there are.
But it's a tiny fraction.
It's certainly a small
and not
fraction.
folks that the FDA at least gives significant credit to, certainly enough that you would change your view with respect to the safety of this food. You all have been very decisive.
To date, we have seen nothing to change the view that we have had for a number of years now.
And that would include, there were questions about what other countries have done and how their regulatory, this would include studies performed all across the world as well.
That is correct.
I've heard some of my colleagues talk about a patchwork of 50 sets of rules and what that might do. Just so we're all clear, it wouldn't just be 50 sets of rules, it is potentially thousands of sets of rules. Cities, counties, townships, neighborhood associations, the mind reels with respect to folks who might want to confirm their theory of a right to know through some sort of statutory or municipal rule. Tell me what you think that complexity would do to the safety of the food supply chain.
I don't know that it would have an effect on safety.
Right, the confusion consumers, we were talking about this with Mr. Matheson. He said he had to go 2,000 miles. You might only have to go 2 miles to pass into a city that had a different set of rules. I think there'd be massive confusion, and the impact that that would have on consumers' ability to understand what they were consuming would be pretty significant.
I suppose it could be my point was that the underlying safety of the food would not be
Wouldn't change, absolutely. You've talked a bit about your pre-market consultation process today. You said that most of the folks are entering this into commercial service have provided that for you. You said you've gone through 100, a few have been withdrawn. I want to make sure no one's run through the stop sign to date, where the FDA said, hey, we have a question or a concern, and they've said, good for you, we still want to introduce this product to the marketplace.
That's correct.
No one's run through the stop sign.
That's correct.
It's not your expectation that anyone ever would, because it'd be very difficult for a commercialized food product to have run through an FDA letter that says, hey, we think we've got a health or safety issue.
That is our view, yes.
You talked about petitions for natural. We're going to give you another one if I get this bill passed into law. This law contains a provision which would require the FDA within 24 months to propose a regulation with respect to natural. I agree with some of my colleagues, frankly, on both sides of the aisle that I think we ought to clear that up so that consumers have a good idea what that really means. I understand the difficulty of that task and why you all have not come to fruition on that yet, but know that if we're successful in getting this particular bill passed, you'll get to be successful in your endeavor as well. Has anyone, so there have been proposals in some cities and some states about labeling for genetically engineered products. Have any of those folks come to you or to the FDA to ask for your wisdom about what that label ought to look like or about the safety or science behind genetically engineered foods?
Not that I'm aware of.
So no, to the best of your knowledge, none of the states have come to you to say, hey, what does the FDA think about this?
Not that I'm aware of, and it's certainly conceivable that someone from a
Sure.
state would have come somewhere in the agency, but not that I'm aware of.
And I guess my last question is, this bill proposes that we would make the review process at FDA mandatory as opposed to voluntary, assuming that we provide the resources to the FDA such that they can handle all of the requests for review. Do you think that's an improvement? That is, do you think it is the case that each of these products ought to be submitted for FDA review before commercialization?
Yes, and we think that is happening now.
Great, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. That concludes the questions of the members are present. I'm sure we will have follow-up questions, other questions from members. We'll submit to those to you in writing. We ask that you please respond promptly. Thank you very much for coming this morning. We're going to take, while the staff sets up this second panel a 3-minute recess. The subcommittee's in recess. The subcommittee will come to order. We'll ask our guests to please take their seats, and I'll introduce the second panel at this time. First of all, Dr. Allison Van NNM, Cooperative Extension Specialist in Animal Genomics and Biotechnology, Department of Animal Science from the University of California, Davis. Secondly, Mr. Scott Faber, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the Environmental Working Group. Representative Kate Webb, Assistant Majority Leader in the Vermont House of Representatives. Ms. Stacy Forshee, the 5th District Director of the Kansas Farm Bureau. And finally, Mr. Tom Dempsey, President and CEO of the Snack Food Association. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate your patience. You'll each have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. Your written testimony will be made a part of the record. So Dr. Van NNM, I think is the way you pronounce your name, right? I'm sorry for mispronunciation. We'll start with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your summary.
All right. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Alison Van Eenenam, and I'm a biotechnology and genomics cooperative extension specialist at the University of California in Davis, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this topic here today. I work in the public sector as a scientist performing research and education on biotechnology. And one of the reasons I'm testifying here today is that I was the task force chair and the lead author of the CAST issue paper number 54 entitled The Potential Impacts of Mandatory Labeling for Genetically Engineered Food in the United States that was released in April of this year, and it's included as an attachment to this testimony. And it basically explores the scientific, legal, and economic aspects of requiring food labeling in the United States based on the use of a breeding method, that is genetic engineering, rather than on some specific attribute of the food product itself. And it also looks at the implications of state versus national labeling laws and the potential economic impacts, and so I think it's very germane to today's discussion. As a scientist speaking here today, I do want to clarify that GE food, commonly but less precisely referred to as genetically modified food, is food derived from crops produced using a breeding method based on the movement of useful genes from one species into another using recombinant DNA technology. This method is used routinely in medicine, and many pharmaceuticals such as insulin and food processing aids such as rennin used in cheese production have been made by GE microbes. Although most commercialized crops that have been developed using GE this far have been made to resist insects or herbicides, this breeding method can be used for many purposes, and public sector scientists in Hawaii and New York, for example, use GE to produce a virus-resistant papaya, a papaya that virtually saved the Hawaiian papaya industry. Other introductions include drought-tolerant corn, virus-resistant squash, and consumer traits like a non-browning apple, a low-acrylamide potato, and crops that produce improved oils for nutrition. Land-grant university researchers in California, Florida, and Texas are working to use genetic engineering to develop oranges that are resistant to citrus greening disease, something that's devastating the Florida orange industry, and grape varieties that are resistant to Pierce's disease. In New York, researchers are using a wheat gene to develop an American chestnut tree that is resistant to the imported chestnut blight. These disease-resistant GE applications focus on controlling disease with genetics rather than with chemicals. And importantly, they don't involve the use of chemical pesticides, an issue that often gets conflated with GE as a breeding method. In 2013, genetically engineered crops were cultivated worldwide by 18 million farmers. And in the United States, GE varieties were planted on 95% of sugar beet acreage, 93% of soy, and over 90% of both cotton and corn acreage. What's been the impacts of this widespread adoption? As a scientist, I look to the peer-reviewed independent literature, especially meta-analyses and review articles that present a summary of many independent studies. In 2014, German university professors published a comprehensive analysis of 147 studies that have assessed the impact of the adoption of genetically engineered crops. They found the benefits were significant, and in summary, on average, GE technology adoption reduced chemical pesticide use by 37%, increased crop yields by 22%, and increased farmer profits by 68%. This would explain their widespread adoption by farmers globally. As a result of this widespread use in American agriculture, many food products in the United States include ingredients that might be from corn oil or sugar beet sugar that have been derived from GE crop varieties. And it's said before, it's been estimated 70 to 80% of processed foods likely contain such ingredients. Importantly, many highly processed ingredients, such as sugar and oil, contain no detectable traces of DNA or protein, and hence there is no way to test these refined products to determine their genetic origin, meaning labeling of these products would require entire supply chain tracking and segregation to keep track of the products derived from genetically engineered crops, a very expensive and complicated proposition. There is a broad scientific consensus about the safety of food produced from GE crop varieties and solid data to support that consensus. A 2013 review article written by independent Italian public sector scientists reviewed over 1,700 safety records of GE crop safety published this past decade and concluded that the scientific research conducted so far has not detected any significant hazards directly connected with the use of GE crops. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, the world's largest and most prestigious scientific society, stated in 2012, "The science is quite clear. Crop improvement by the modern molecular techniques of biotechnology is safe." The World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, the US National Academy of Sciences, the British Royal Society, and every other major scientific body and regulatory agency in the world that has examined the evidence has come to the same conclusion. To date, no material differences in composition or safety of commercialized crops developing use GE has been identified that would justify a label based on the use of GE as a breeding method in the development of that crop variety. Whilst this conclusion will not satisfy those who consider the insertion or manipulation of genes in a laboratory a material difference per se, the science of food safety does not support mandatory process-based labeling of GE food, and by extension is not required by the Food and Drug Administration. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here this morning, and I would be pleased to take questions from the subcommittee.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Now recognize Mr. Faber, 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Pallone, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. First, let me thank you for the tremendous work you and your staff performed on the Sunscreen Innovation Act. We greatly appreciate your work on that important piece of legislation. And let me thank you for dedicating your time to this important issue. As you can tell, people are incredibly passionate about their food. Consumers simply want the right to know what's in their food and how it's produced. More than 90% of consumers, regardless of age, gender, income, or even party affiliation, routinely tell pollsters that they simply want the right to choose, the right to know what's in their food. But this isn't simply a question of right to know. It's also a question of consumer confusion. As Mrs. Capps mentioned earlier, misleading claims like natural claims have led to significant consumer confusion. Roughly 60% of consumers, when buying a package with a natural claim, believe that natural foods, all natural foods, are GMO-free. And we believe that a factual, informative, non-judgmental disclosure on the back of the package would help address this confusion. Now let me be very, very clear. We are not seeking a warning of any kind. We are simply seeking a factual, non-judgmental disclosure on the back of the package, and we're confident, as Mr. Pallone suggested earlier, that food companies, farmers, FDA, consumer groups can work together to craft a disclosure that provides consumers basic information without rendering a judgment on the technology. Unfortunately, FDA has the authority to require such a disclosure, and as Mr. Waxman alluded to earlier, has used this authority in the past. And that's fortunate because we would greatly, greatly prefer a national GMO labeling solution. But in the absence of leadership from FDA, we believe that states should and can act to require a mandatory disclosure. Congress has long recognized a role for the states, a leading role for the states in food labeling, and that's why the NLEA was carefully crafted to not preempt state labeling laws such as the GMO disclosure laws that have been passed by states like Vermont. Now, you've certainly heard arguments made today, and we'll hear more arguments made by this panel, that GMO labeling will increase food prices. But you don't have to work for the Grocery Manufacturers Association or work for the food industry to know that food companies change their labels all the time to highlight new claims or new innovations. You'll also hear today that GMO labeling will create costly new farm and food the need for costly new farm and food segregation systems. But those systems have been in place for decades to address allergens and to meet growing demand for non-GMO and organic choices, all the way from the farm to the elevator to the processor to the retailer. In fact, the snack food industry has launched more non-GMO project offerings in the last decade than any other segment of the food industry. You'll also hear, and also have heard and will hear again, that we need GMO crops to feed the world. So first, let me say, no one is seeking a ban on GMO crops. And let me point out also that many farm groups, including the National Farmers Union, support mandatory GMO labeling. But it's also worth noting that we've run the experiment for the last 20 years, and so far, yields of conventional crops have kept pace with yields of GE crops. Now, I agree with testimony you'll hear from Ms. Forshee that farmers should have choices, but so should consumers. We need a national GMO labeling system that works for farmers, that works for food companies, but that also works for consumers. Unfortunately, H.R. 4432 does not provide a national mandatory labeling system. In fact, H.R. 4432 narrows FDA's ability to work with us, to work with farmers, to work with the food industry to craft such a system. It fails to restrict the misleading natural claims that have fueled so much consumer confusion, and it preempts state laws that are ultimately designed to protect consumers from this confusion. Mr. Chairman, people simply want to know what's in their food. They want to be able to make choices for their families, and I hope that you'll work with us to give consumers the right to know whether or not their food contains genetically modified food ingredients. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize Representative Webb, 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee. My name is Kate Webb. I'm a representative and assistant majority leader from the good state of Vermont, and I was the lead sponsor on Act 120, a law that simply gives consumers the right to know if the food they purchase in Vermont is genetically engineered. The law is at risk should H.R. 4322 become law. Because Vermont is involved in litigation regarding this very issue, I want to be clear that I'm not a lawyer, not a scientist, and not here as a representative of my state or my government. I'm here as a Vermont citizen to tell you of the importance of this right to the citizens of my state and other states whose citizens seek this simple request for transparency. Vermont's Act 120, an act relating to the labeling of food produced with genetic engineering, was signed into law this May to great fanfare and celebration on our State House steps. This bill grew from grassroots efforts of tens of thousands of Vermonters seeking to have a right to make an informed choice about the food they purchase. This desire was not limited to a handful of Vermonters. Survey upon survey has shown that more than 75% of Vermonters were in favor of such labeling. I personally became involved in this legislation in 2012, and over the next 3 years, we developed draft legislation to gain the fundamental right to know how our food is produced. Drafts that traveled through 6 legislative committees who received testimony from over 100 people, including scientists, lawyers, academics, consumers, manufacturers, and food producers on both sides of the issue. Act 120 in its final form is the result of many hours, weeks, and years of work, and it passed the Senate. I want you to hear this, the Senate on a vote of 28-2. It passed the House on a vote of 114-30. These are large numbers. Why is it that Vermont wants this right? It's about transparency and truth in labeling. Even the World Health Organization defines genetically modified food as foods derived from organisms whose genetic material has been modified in a way that does not occur naturally. And Monsanto defines genetically engineered organisms as plants or animals that have had their genetic makeup altered to exhibit traits that are not naturally theirs. However, many genetically engineered products continue to carry the word natural or variations of this word on their labels. I believe this is misleading, and Act 120 would prohibit the use of this term for products produced or partially produced with genetic engineering. Because GE is a relatively new and evolving science, consumers concerned about the unintentional environmental and health effects want the right to exercise this precaution. And finally, we heard testimony that without labeling, members of many religious communities could not tell if products they purchased violated their faith's dietary prohibitions. There is nothing in our law that restricts anyone from producing or selling genetically engineered products. There is nothing in our law that says it is good or bad. Businesses and farming will go on as business and farming always does. One of the great strengths of a capitalist democracy is not only do we cast a vote at the polls, we also do so by selecting the products we purchase. Transparency allows us to see how things work, be it in government, financial institutions, or the food we eat. This transparency allows us to make informed decisions and ultimately build trust. States have historically and continue today to lead the way on food labeling. 41 states regulated the use of sell-by and use-by dates on food labels. Before Congress mandated our current federal country of origin label, which also doesn't state whether it's good or bad, nor does our bill, these requirements existed in Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas, who required labeling disclosure about the source and production of catfish. And many states regulate the labeling of cottage foods. I believe Tennessee and Mississippi do this. And many states were already regulating the labeling of bottled water before the FDA set standards of identity. While the USDA and AMS issue voluntary grading standards for some agricultural products, many states also issue these grading labels. Vermont's legislature did so with maple syrup this year. Mr. Chairman, our state is already involved in litigation with the Groceries Manufacturers Association, among others. And this will help to answer if Vermont and any other state has the constitutional right to label. I urge you to defeat H.R. 4432 and promote federal labeling. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Ms. Forshee, you're recognized 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Chairman Pitts and Ranking Member Pallone and all the other committee members, it's an honor and privilege to sit in front of you today. My name is Stacy Forshee. My husband David and I are fifth generations to farm in Cloud County, Kansas, in north central Kansas. We live near the small community of Delphus, and just to put it in perspective, I'm 20 miles away from my nearest grocery store. I am a member of the Cloud County Farm Bureau Association. I serve on the board of directors for Kansas Farm Bureau for a 10-county area. I'm also a part of the Cloud County Community College Ag Advisory Board, Cloud Corp Board of Directors, and I also sit on my Concordia High School Booster Club board. But my most important job is to a wife of my husband David for 24 years, who I farm right alongside, as well as our children, Kendra, Lauren, and Wyatt. But you know, raising our children on our farm hasn't always exactly been easy, but we are very proud of what we've accomplished. Today, we farm approximately 2,000 acres that we grow corn, soybeans, alfalfa, wheat, and other feed crops for our cattle. We operate a feed cow-calf operation that has about 700 cows that my husband's home finishing calving for me right now, but the majority of them will calve in the spring. We also operate a small feedlot that enables us to feed our own cattle, and actually much of what we grow, sometimes we are able to feed them. We also custom feed other producers' cattle. We have a custom hay grinding operation where we grind area cattlemen's hay for them, and we also buy and sell quality alfalfa and we supply dairies and feedlots throughout Kansas. But first and most importantly, I am a mom and I am a consumer and a farmer. So I would never want my children to eat anything or anybody else's children to consume something that was bad for them, that was unsafe. And as a farmer, my family would never want anything to enter the food supply that we raised or that we grew that would be proven to be unsafe. And there's been, very many, all the credible studies have shown that genetically modified ingredients and products are safe. On our farm, we use this biotechnology to be able to conserve moisture. We also have found that by using this technology, we can up to 40% we can save on fuel, on fertilizer, and on pesticides. We have seen that that drop over the last 24 years. We also, we're stewards of the land. The environment is very important to us. So the less we use of all of these things are very important, and we owe that to biotechnology. Labeling a safe product to me as a consumer just does not make any sense. So I just feel that this, making a mandatory label is going to mislead consumers into thinking that it is unsafe, which we have heard today that that is wrong. With the future projections of our growing world, farmers and ranchers around the world are going to have to double their food production to meet those growing demands. And on my farm, biotechnology is a way that we feel like we can make this happen. On our farm, we also have the ability to store more than 20,000 bushels of grain. When we harvest our crops, we store that grain in different bins. I mean, due to crop insurance regulations, there are certain things that we need to abide by, but we can store all one kind of grain in one bin. And the same is true for my local elevators and all our rural communities. For us, we do this so that we can market that crop later or feed it to our livestock. But it would cost billions of dollars in infrastructure and new technology to be able to just absolutely trace a biological trait from my farm to the consumer's table. As a mother and a farmer, I urge Congress to pass this H.R. 4432, the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act, for me to be able to continue to farm like I do and to meet the growing future's needs. I really urge you to do this, and I really thank you for your time.
Chair thanks, gentlelady, and now recognizes Mr. Dempsey. 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the subcommittee, Chairman Pitts and Ranking Member Pallone, for holding this hearing to provide a balanced review of one of the most critical issues facing the food industry today, the labeling of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. My name is Tom Dempsey. I have served as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Snack Food Association, the SFA, since 2013. Prior to joining SFA, I was the president of one of the largest privately owned snack food brands in the United States. Today at SFA, I represent over 400 companies who produce snacks ranging from potato chips to granola bars. My members include both billion-dollar multi-category companies and small family-owned businesses in the second and third generation of management. More than half of SFA members have sales of less than $100 million a year, and many are the primary employers in their community. While voters have rejected ballot initiatives calling for mandatory GMO labeling in 4 states, the state of Vermont recently approved the nation's first mandatory GMO labeling law. Mandatory GMO labeling at the state level would impact nearly every aspect of my members' business, upping costs by requiring increased product inventory, added complexity for packaging and distribution processes, and extensive new regulatory and training requirements. Absent a federal solution, manufacturers will have essentially 3 options to comply with state GMO labeling law: redesign their packaging, reformulate products so that no labeling is required, or halt sales to that state. Each option is difficult, costly, time-intensive, and at worst, could eliminate jobs and consumer choice in the marketplace. Smaller companies may not have these options at all. A patchwork of GMO labeling laws would pose significant burdens on the manufacturing process itself. They would require separate storage for GMO and non-GMO products throughout the entire supply chain, beginning with the farmer and extending through various states of production and distribution. Aside from new administrative and record-keeping burdens, snack makers will be forced to clean and boil the sheeting, baking, frying, and seasoning lines between GMO and non-GMO production to ensure there is no contamination. This could take up to 2 hours and would lead to a loss in valuable production time. Duplicative food labeling for the same stock keeping unit, or SKU, assigned to each product line is also a problem. Film, which is our industry's term for snack packaging, would need to be changed mid-production, and 2 separate inventories of the same finished product must be kept. Significant lead times and costs would go into bag changes. The cost in plate charges, new film, administrative oversight could be more than $750,000 for 800 SKUs, and the process could take 20 to 26 weeks. GMO and non-GMO products must continue to be segregated from the factory to the grocery store, resulting in increased distribution costs and heightened opportunity for mistakes. To be clear, the hardest hit by this will be the one-plant operators with a single line of production. These costs could put family-owned businesses out of business, thereby increasing consolidation in the industry. While it is sometimes assumed that companies could remove the GMO ingredients from their products, this is unrealistic because the availability of non-GMO crops is limited. Over 80%, although I heard today, 90% of the corn, cotton, and soybean crops in the United States are produced with biotechnology, all products which are staple items in the snack production. Our members will not have the opportunity to increase their contract with farmers or mills for non-GMO corn for a minimum of 2 years. Transitioning to GMO-free production will not happen overnight. Some manufacturers may choose to end distribution in states that require GMO labeling, resulting in fewer product options for consumers and causing a ripple effect in the grocery industry. Even if manufacturers notify grocers of their intent to stop selling in a state, manufacturers could run the risk of being fined if retailers do not comply or if mistakes happen in the distribution process. Fewer players in the aisle could mean less incentive to keep quality high and prices low. Fewer products could disproportionately cause job losses for some in the distribution chain. Ultimately, a patchwork of state GMO laws will hit consumers the hardest and would result in either increased costs of the grocery store or less availability of products in their stores. In addition, it is important to note that consumers already have options to purchase non-GMO foods, and these options continue to expand. For over a decade, both the USDA's Natural Organic Program and the Independent Non-GMO Project have certified foods that are organic and GMO-free, respectively. The process to gain these certification seals is not only rigorous, but expensive. Many SFA members have already made the significant investment to display these voluntary labels. Forcing companies to relabel more than 80% of their products does nothing but add cost, confusion, and may limit choices to consumers. SFA does not have a single member company that manufactures, distributes, and sells in just one state, which makes state labeling law incredibly complex. Multiply these challenges by 5, 10, or even 25 states, and an insurmountable burden is placed on the supply chain. SFA supports the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act, which eliminates the proposed patchwork of state laws by creating one federal GMO standard and provides much-needed consistency for manufacturers and consumers alike. Thank you for your time.
Chair thanks all of our witnesses for your testimony. I'll begin the questioning. Recognize myself 5 minutes for that purpose. Dr. Van Inem, is there currently a lack of consensus about the validity of research and science behind the safety of foods and ingredients derived from genetically engineered crops?
Well, as I stated in my testimony, there's clear consensus amongst all of the leading scientific organizations throughout the world, and the meta-analysis of over 1,700 studies, about a third of which are done by the public sector that do not have any industry funding, somewhere in that vicinity, have all come to the same conclusion that there are no unique risks posed by the use of this particular breeding method in the production of genetically engineered crops. Consensus doesn't mean unanimity, so there are scientists that you'll hear that say that that's not true, but to your question earlier, it's as strong of a consensus, it's probably stronger than on global warming. It's 99 to 1 or something in that vicinity. And I think if you get consensus of all of the major scientific societies in the world, then that's a pretty strong consensus.
The first generation of biotechnology products has brought tremendous benefits to farmers, as we've heard. What do you see as the potential for consumer-facing benefits of the next generation of biotechnology products?
So certainly, and I might argue the consumers had some benefit from the first generation also because of the decreased insecticide use associated with BT crops, for example, has knock-on benefits for the environment and the consumer and also costs. But there are direct benefit traits being developed for consumers, for example, altered nutritional profiles of crops for improved human health, and particularly in developing nations, there's efforts to biofortify crops to improve the nutritional profile of staple crops of the world's poor to improve their nutrition. And so there's a huge interest amongst public sector scientists and also public-private partnerships to try to use this technology to improve foodstuffs and improve the nutritional composition of crops for both developed and developing countries.
As a scientist, could you put in layman's terms, you said this requires the use of less pesticides. How does that occur? How do they make that occur?
For example, the insect-protected crops have a protein in them that basically targets lepidopteran caterpillars so that when they eat the crop, they perish, but it's safe for humans, and so it basically enables farmers not to have to put insecticide on that crop. And so, for example, especially in the developing world, there's been a dramatic reduction in insecticides, over they've decreased their insecticide use by over half, and they've doubled their yields as a result of protecting the crops from the insects and not having to use more dangerous insecticides to protect those crops. And so it's kind of breeding the crop to be protected from insects, and therefore you can decrease your insecticide use. And even in the US, it's decreased the use of insecticides on BT corn over 10-fold since the adoption of this technology.
Thank you, Mr. Faber. How would you describe or define natural?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mr. Chairman. I think common sense definition of natural for an ordinary consumer would not include genetically modified ingredients. In fact, one of the major providers of the technology, Monsanto itself, does not define biotech traits to be something that should be described as natural. And I think you're getting it right at the heart of the matter, which is that consumers go to the store, they see an all-natural or natural disclosure, and roughly 60%, depending on the study, 58%, 64%, and others, believe that that food is GMO-free. What's important here is that we want consumers to be using their buying power to shape their lives and the world around them. If they're confused about what they're buying, they're not able to use their buying power to really make good, informed choices.
Thank you. Representative Webb, when would your law become effective? Is it effective now?
We're involved in rulemaking now. Rules should be out July 2015 and in effect July 2016.
All right. Ms. Forshee or Mr. Dempsey, how would this labeling requirement affect your snack food companies if they did not wish to comply?
Well, as I said, there's three options. They can reformulate, they could label, or they could cease sales within Vermont. And I think each individual company is going to have to make that decision based upon the number of businesses and SKUs that have to be relabeled.
And finally, Ms. Forshee, how would or has biotechnology impacted the way you farm, say, in the past decade?
Well, I would say that we're able, with that kind of technology, we're able to use a practice of no-till, which allows us to conserve moisture and, not spray the crops, nearly as much as, there's a whole notion of that farmers just dump pesticides and herbicides on their crops, but we don't. It is very costly to do that kind of an application, spray any kind of an application. And so we are very, it's very, I want to say we use GPS to do that so that there's just the right amount put on the crop and no more. And so the less we can do that, the more it's going to help our bottom dollar too for yields. So we have seen higher yields as well on our farm. in the last, 24 years
And
as a result of that.
With no-till, less runoff, water runoff?
That's correct. As long as, and also though the biotechnology traits in our crops, it all comes together as one.
Thank you. My time has expired. Chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Lone. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Faber and Representative Webb, you both believe that industry should be required to label all foods that contain GE ingredients, and you both also characterize such labeling requirements as a modest disclosure or simple request. And Mr. Faber, you also state that food companies frequently change their labels to make new claims or to highlight new innovations. And I think an accurate summary of your position on this is that it simply is not a big deal for companies who use GE ingredients to label their products as such. And Mr. Dempsey, on the hand, makes the argument that mandatory labeling for GE foods would dramatically increase the cost of the food because it would require manufacturers to segregate the food or use multiple labeling films, a number of things. I guess in my view, on the one hand, if it's truly not that burdensome for industry to label their food, then why shouldn't they be required to do so? On the other hand, if the labeling requirement could result in higher food costs, maybe that's not a risk that we want to take. So let me just ask you these questions in light of that. First, Mr. Faber or Representative Webb, can you elaborate on why you believe a mandatory labeling requirement is simple for industry, and how do you respond to the assertion by Mr. Dempsey and others in industry that complying with that requirement would be an elaborate and expensive prospect? Briefly, if you can, because I want to ask him a question too.
Absolutely. So very briefly. So there, essentially, we've heard a reference from Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Butterfield to this $500 cost associated with food labeling. That study assumes two things, and one thing in particular is that that disclosure would ultimately equal disparagement, that consumers would see a disclosure, they would stop eating food made with genetically modified food ingredients, and that would cause costly supply chain disruptions or force consumers to buy organic. What we know about how consumers use labels is they tend to look for certain attributes. You may look for fiber, I may look for calories. We tend not to read the whole package. We use that information to make particular decisions about our food choices. So the notion that consumers, American consumers, are going to broadly reject foods with a modest, non-judgmental disclosure, I think, is unfounded. We know that in part because we have labeling in 64 other countries, including countries like Brazil, where there's been a disclosure since 2001, and consumers more or less eat the way they have for the last 13 years. So I think we can all be confident that if we craft the disclosure in the right way, to your earlier point, Mr. Pallone, that we can give consumers information without rendering a judgment that ultimately leads to significant changes in buying behavior. The other thing I'll just quickly say again is that companies are already finding ways to make both non-GMO and GMO foods. We have segregation throughout the supply chain. We preserve identity of these grains throughout the supply chain, in part because of marketing needs, but also because of quality and allergen needs. So there's already an infrastructure in place that allows us to segregate non-GMO and GMO and other kinds of grains and oils.
All right, I'm going to go to Mr. Dempsey now because I want you to respond to those claims and specifically respond to the assertion that food companies, they're changing their labels so they can easily do this. How do you respond to what Mr. Faber is saying?
Certainly, food companies change their labels, but not on a wholesale banner and do all of them all at the same time. So you run into a big situation of X number of SKUs that have to be done all at the same time to comply with a law that goes into effect in 2016. Small businesses would be hit very hard because of that. They have historically been ones who change their labels very seldomly. In central Pennsylvania, I can probably think of 5 or 6 companies that are using the same graphics, same bags that they've had for many years. The only change is those being mandated by the FDA. So I think the real burden comes on the small family-owned, small operators who have SKUs that are genetically modified and have to label them. And rather than using what the market has now, and that is the option of a non-GMO or GMO-free certification, to notify and give consumers transparency, which gives the manufacturer the option of doing it.
Can I add just one quick thing?
Well, maybe I'll ask Representative Webb. We've got 40 seconds if you want to say something.
I would say that we are in rulemaking process now. We have manufacturers that are weighing in on how that label will be will be written. We're hoping that our labeling will be something that other states can use. The standards between Maine, Connecticut, and Vermont, the legislation is similar. We are also a small state. We have 630,000 people in our entire state. People already drive to New Hampshire to avoid the sales tax. So if the industry chooses not to sell in Vermont, I'm sure that we can get our Doritos over the state lines.
All right.
And I'd just like to add that not only do companies change their packaging all the time, the average lifespan of a label is about a year, we ask companies to change their disclosures. We ask them to change them for trans fat. We ask them to change them for allergen labeling. And we are about to ask them to change their labels as part of a refresh of the Nutrition Facts Panel. So there are periods in the history of labeling where we ask companies to disclose a little bit more about what's in the food. This is the perfect time, since we're in the midst of an NFP rulemaking, to think about how can we make this disclosure in a way that's non-judgmental.
Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, 5 minutes for questions.
Well, and I would have to say that from listening to the testimony today that I am convinced that we have to have a national policy. And we can argue, Representative Webb, about what that policy ought to be, Mr. Faber. We can argue about what that policy ought to be, but I think it needs to be national. It may be relatively easy for Vermonters to cross the state lines to get their Doritos, but I would have to submit that in parts of my district, and I represent the southwestern portion of Virginia, the Allegheny Highlands of Virginia, and Southside Virginia. It's a large district. It may be larger than Vermont. It certainly has more people in it. But there are parts of that where if you wanted to go and get some other product, you'd have to drive several hours. There are other parts where you just walk across the street. And so if you had a grocer on one side of the street and you looked at the labeling in that state and said, in Tennessee, on State Street, and you said, I don't know about this genetic engineering. And you walk across the street, it might be the very same product, but it might not have that label in Virginia. So I'm convinced we have to have a national label. And just a few miles up the road from State Street, where you literally are on the main street of the town, and you're one state on one side and on the other, in another state on the other side of the street, is probably one of your members, Mr. Dempsey. Shearer Foods has a potato chip facility there, and they obviously ship to a number of states from that Bristol, Virginia plant.
That's correct.
And so that concerns me, that they'd have to have different labels for all the states that they operate in. But I'm particularly concerned about, if we don't have a national policy, concerned that the consumer gets confused into what is it I'm buying. Well, if I buy it in Virginia, it's a different product than what I'm buying in Tennessee. I don't know whether you have any towns like that in Vermont that straddle the state line, but I have a number of them: Bristol, Virginia, Tennessee; Bluefield, Virginia; West Virginia. The Martinsville area has, towns. If you didn't know where you were, you'd be out of Henry County and into North Carolina in a heartbeat, traveling down 220. And so I think we have to be very, very concerned about that. And I do think it's important. And then the other thing is your rulemaking process. I know your Attorney General's in charge of that, but what experience does Vermont have, Representative Webb, in food labeling? I mean, is this something that they've done before in some kind of a large way? And what are they doing in that process to try to label these foods?
Well, as I previously stated, we did make some changes to our maple syrup labeling.
And you broke your...
I'm not on?
Yeah. You did say that about maple syrup, and what was the difference? I just assumed it was a parochial difference.
Excuse me, sorry. Our labeling had been grade A, grade B. We chose to go with the standards that they're using in Quebec because they're a larger producer than our brave little state.
And grade A, grade B, what do they use in Quebec?
Oh goodness,
because I got to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
My wife disagrees with me. I can't tell the difference between A or B.
Yeah.
So I always buy B because it's cheaper.
Yeah, I like B too.
Yeah. But what's the Quebec standard, so I'll know what I'm looking at when I go to store?
I would have to look it up.
You'd have to look it up. All right, I appreciate that. That was not fair to ask you today. Anyway, I apologize. I do think it's complicated. And I would ask folks who are here today or who are watching at home, if you have suggestions on how you might make some reasonable changes to Mr. Pompeo's bill. He may or may not accept them, but I would ask that you submit those to the committee so that we can take a look at those changes, because I'm convinced we have to have a national standard. And I would like to know, if I'm buying something that's labeled natural, and I do that on a fairly regular basis. I'd like to know that there's something standard about it, and so I'd like to see us move in that direction as well.
And Mr. Griffith, we would be thrilled to work with you and with our colleagues in the food industry and to craft a national disclosure that's mandatory, but that works for the consumer, but that also works for food manufacturers who have to operate in 50 states. I think if people of goodwill could find a way to develop a disclosure that is truly non-judgmental, and I'd welcome the opportunity to do that.
Well, and I appreciate that. I will tell you that in thinking about this over the years, as you may have heard earlier, I do read labels fairly carefully. Yes, I know. And I'm convinced now that genetically modified or genetically engineered foods are so prevalent that we probably need to go the other way. And for those of us that may want to purchase something, that the labeling requirement ought to be on those who can certify that their food is in fact does not have this product in it, as opposed to the reverse.
That's right. And you and I may agree or disagree about whether or not there are more herbicides or fewer herbicides, or I think the bottom line here is that consumers want to be able to make those choices themselves. And it ultimately boils down not just to an issue of transparency, but an issue of trust. If we give parents, consumers, the basic information, we should trust them to do their homework and make those choices for themselves.
I appreciate that, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I see my time's up and yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses, thank you for being at this hearing and your testimony. I think we're finding ourselves in general agreement that a good federal standard for GE labeling is preferable to a confusing patchwork of state labeling rules, which appears that we have today. But there still is disagreement about what exactly that standard should be. I want to be clear, I don't believe this is even a debate about whether or not GE foods are safe. It's a debate about whether or not consumers have the right to know what is in their food. And I think I'm just echoing what some of you have said. I firmly believe that consumers do have the right to make informed decisions about the food they eat, and I believe we pretty much all agree on this point. Just to get it on the record, however, what about now a simple yes or no question, so we can get this on the record? And I'll start with Dr. Ben Enneman, and right down the line, yes or no. Do you think consumers should have the right to know what is in their food?
I can't give you a yes or no answer to that.
You can't say yes or no?
No, because I don't think that the labeling is about what's in the food. It's about the process used to make the food. And that's a really subtle difference.
I
so
hear you.
Sugar from genetically engineered sugar beet is the same as sugar from non-genetically engineered sugarcane sugar.
All right. I wanted to go faster than that, but we'll give you
so
that.
I mean, because I think we're not discussing about what's a label of what's in the food. We're talking about a label of how it was produced.
Well, I think that could be under the umbrella, but that yes, we do need to do this. We also need to talk about how to do it and what should be in it. But I'll just go right along.
Yeah, of course consumers should have the right to know what's in their food.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
It depends on how easy it is to give them the right to know. I mean, I think that's a yes-no is too simple a response.
All right, I got an answer. Unfortunately, consumers currently do not have access to all the information they are looking for when it comes to GE foods. And consumers are often confused further confused enough by not knowing what's in it, and then confused by the information that they find on the packaging. So I'll now zero in on you, Mr. Faber. Why do you think there's currently so much consumer confusion when it comes to GE labels?
Well, consumers have been deluged with misleading claims for many, many years, especially claims like natural. They perceive those claims, all natural, to mean something that they don't. They perceive those claims to mean GMO-free. And they are using their buying power in a way that they think is improving the world around them when it's actually not. And
it's not. So you agree that the current voluntary system is not working?
And the voluntary system isn't serving consumers, and codifying the voluntary system as H.R. 4432 would just continue to create more and more consumer
That was my next question, so I can just let you underscore it again. One of the arguments in favor of H.R. 4432 is that it'll reduce this confusion. You disagree?
We strongly disagree. I think if we lived in a world where consumers perfectly understood what natural, non-GMO, organic, and other claims meant, then a voluntary system might make sense. We don't live in that world.
Right.
We live in a world where consumers are extraordinarily confused about what they're buying at the point of sale.
Well, I think we would all also agree that this is certainly a complicated topic, and any labeling system must be implemented carefully and in close consultation with the industry, with all the stakeholders. But the current system, I believe, and I think there is some agreement here, is not working for consumers. So I'm concerned that the bill we have before us, I guess I agree with you, Mr. Faber, that it just largely codifies the inadequate rules that we now have. But I have 50 seconds left to ask you, and you agree that consumers are making decisions with their wallets, and they choose to avoid GE products, not because of food safety concerns I want to bring up and let you respond to, but because of their environmental impact as well. So that's a further aspect, at least for many of my constituents. What are some of the environmental concerns that consumers are now having with the GE crops?
Thank you, Mrs. Kapp. There are many reasons that people want the right to know what's in their food. One is that the widespread adoption of GE corn and GE soybeans in the U.S. has increased the amount of herbicides that we use, and as those herbicides have become less effective due to weed resistance, has forced farmers to turn to even more toxic herbicides like 2,4-D, mentioned by Mr. Kowski.
And so, again, you think consumers should be able to take this kind of information into account as well when making food choices?
Consumers overwhelmingly tell us, tell consumer attitudes experts, they simply want to have that information so they can make those choices for themselves.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Now I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it so very much, and thank you for holding this hearing. I have a couple questions. Dr. Ehneman, can you describe the current issue with citrus greening affecting orange trees throughout the country? What is the role of GM technology in helping to fight this devastating disease?
Well, as Florida industry in particular is being hit by this particular disease, and there's, as plant breeders, looking for options as to how we might go about trying to solve the issue, and there are several land-grant universities I'm aware of, Florida and Texas and California, all looking at both conventional breeding, if that's an option, but also genetic engineering options. And I think that's the power of the technology, is you can bring in a gene from another species to enable those trees to be resistant to the citrus greening disease. And that's really, I think, the opportunity that exists to utilize this technology to develop disease-resistant plants that are able to withstand devastating diseases like citrus greening disease or Pierce's disease. And I think many public sector scientists see this as a real opportunity to develop plants that are healthier, don't require any pesticidal inputs or anything. It's just basically breeding to make those trees healthier and able to withstand that disease.
Thank you very much.
I think that's a really important, depending what the application of the genetically engineered crop is, depends on the environmental impacts. For example, the disease-resistant papaya doesn't require any inputs, and it enables those crops to grow. And so I think that you have to look at the application as to whether or not it has an increased or decreased effect on pesticide use, and it's application-specific and location-specific and country-specific.
Thank you so much, Doctor. And I am from the state of Florida, so I have a real interest. Ms. Forche, how much fuel does it take to plant and harvest your field? I know you talked about this a little bit. You alluded to it in your statement.
How much what?
How much fuel does it take to plant and harvest your field?
Well, I would say that, from planting to harvesting,
oh, approximate.
Right. I would say right now on my farm, we are not tilling the land. We are no-till farming. So we use fuel in our tractor when we plant the crop, which probably for a couple hours of planting, maybe like on an 80-acre farm, would maybe consume about I would say maybe a quarter of a tank of fuel to maybe half a, tractor tank of fuel. So maybe 75 to 100 gallons there. And then we harvest the crop. I mean, sometimes there does need to be an application if there's a weed problem. But so I would say total from planting to harvesting, maybe a couple 100 gallon. Where before, if we were having to work the ground and, really, put strain on our tractors and equipment, it would double, if not, triple that fuel consumption.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Faber, if genetic modification were the only way to fight a particular disease, would the environmental working group still oppose this type of technology?
Thank you for the question. We do not oppose genetic engineering, genetically modified food ingredients. We think there are actually many promising applications of genetically modified food ingredients. Dr. Van Enneman mentioned several of them. This isn't a question about the technology, this question of whether or not to require labeling. It's really a question of transparency. Should people have this information to make their own choices for their own families? I'm an optimist. I'm optimistic that the promises that were made by the providers of this technology will ultimately be realized, that will have traits that produce more nutritious food, that will see significant yield increases. All of those promises haven't yet been realized. But that's not what's at stake here in this question of whether or not to preempt Act 120 or whether or not to craft a national disclosure system. The real issue is, should people have the right to decide for themselves? And does FDA have the authority now, I believe they do, to work with us to craft some kind of informative, fact-based, non-judgmental disclosure on the back of the package?
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Chair, now recognize Mr. Matheson, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dempsey, in your industry, when people manufacturer makes the product, perhaps someone else is a distributor, perhaps someone else is the grocery store owner. If you have a product that was supposed to be made for the state of Maine and it accidentally went by a truck to Vermont and got put on a shelf, and Vermont charges $1,000 a day fine, who's going to pay the fine out of the manufacturer, the distributor, or the grocery store owner?
My understanding with the Vermont law, the way it is currently crafted, is the manufacturer is responsible for that on $1,000 a day per SKU.
Even if the distributor may be a separate third-party entity that mistakenly went laundering?
The way I understand the law, the retailer is absolutely exempt from that.
Representative Wood, do you think that's a correct interpretation of the law?
Is that to me? The retailer would be responsible if the product was a agricultural product such as corn that was...
I'm talking about a packet of potato chips that got made someplace else and accidentally the distributor took it across state lines.
I would have to check on that.
Okay.
I'm happy to get back to you.
Seems to me in this hearing we're talking about this consumer right to know. I find it interesting. This is on issue. Everyone's acknowledged there's no health or safety risk here. I find this kind of it's the old cliche, a solution in search of a problem. Now, we do have a problem with mislabeling, where people say something's natural and no one can decide what natural is. And I think that Mr. Pompeo's legislation rightly encourages the FDA to move forward on that issue and give clarity to that issue. And I think that's important. I think that's something we got consensus across the board here. But whether or not we should be doing labeling on a component of food that has no demonstrated health or safety risk, that's a tougher one for some of us to swallow, I think.
Mr. Matheson, could I?
No, I'm going to ask you a question instead. I only got 5 minutes. You've indicated you think we should have a national labeling system. But in addition to being a lobbyist for the Environmental Working Group, you are the executive director of Just Label It campaign.
That's correct.
And the Just Label It campaign has spent a lot of money in a lot of states pushing state-based initiatives to set up individual state systems. Do you want state systems or do you want a national system? And why are you encouraging this effort at the state level?
Yeah, and as I testify, and thank you for the question, as I testified, we would greatly prefer a national solution. We believe that FDA has the authority to craft a national solution. FDA has used that authority to require disclosures unrelated to safety and health, to your earlier point. When food's unsafe in the United States, at least since 1906, we don't label it, we take it off the shelves.
We also
And
make sure
but
labels,
we've
but why are
used-
you pursuing it in each state? Tell me why, what's the agenda here?
In the
So I think
app-
there's another
well,
agenda here. if
There's
you're
no
pursuing it at
agenda
the
here
state
except
level.
to protect consumers. And I wish that the administration today would work with us to craft a national solution. In the absence of that leadership, we think it's appropriate for states to step in and help protect consumers.
I appreciate that that's your statement. I tend to question the logic of that. I think if you want a national standard, going out and stirring things up in every state to do a patchwork system that everyone around here says is a bad idea doesn't make much sense to me. And there may, and you know, I don't want to get in a debate with you, but I don't see the consistency in that, and I think there may be other agendas involved in terms of pursuing it at the state level. Congress can help this as well if you want to engage Congress. This committee's holding hearings. I think we can have a conversation if there ought to be some national standard or not. And I welcome this hearing. I welcome Chairman Pitts scheduling this because I think this is an issue that deserves a lot of discussion. But there's another effort going on, and boy, a lot of effort and resources being spent in these different states on state ballot initiatives, and I question what the motivation is and if that really gets us to where anybody in this room really wants to be. Maybe some people want to be there with that patchwork of 50 states. 50 different rules, or as Mr. Pompeo said, maybe we shouldn't limit it to states. It could be counties, it could be cities, it could be a lot more than 50. I think we ought to figure out what we're really trying to do here and what the agendas are, and I think we ought to look for a national standard at best, and I would suggest a national standard ought to be on science-based decision-making about health and safety risk consumers for the integrity of our food supply chain, and that's what I encourage this committee. I think most people on a bipartisan basis would agree that's the motivation for this committee in looking at this issue. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now I recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you. Mr. Faber, do you know if the nutritional fact panel that's now required for products, did the FDA conclude that needed to be there for safety reasons, or was that something that the Congress just decided in response to the demand they heard from the public ought to be on products?
That's a terrific question. So the basis for the nutrition facts panel was to try to promote nutrition and health. The NLEA clearly preempted states from changing the NFP, the nutrition facts panel, from adding things to the ingredient line, or from regulating certain kinds of claims like health claims. But the NLEA was also carefully crafted to preserve for the states other roles in food labeling, and states have already stepped into that role in many ways. And Mrs. Webb talked about this, whether it's grading butter and cheese in Wisconsin or use by and sell by dates in 41 different states. I'm not arguing that for a patchwork quilt, but I think we should recognize that Congress more than 20 years ago explicitly recognized the long-standing role that states have played in food labeling, especially with regards to addressing consumer deception and helping consumers understand what they're buying.
Mr. Dempsey, if the choice were between a situation where there was 50 different labeling regimes or one uniform labeling requirement, but that requirement was that you had to indicate whether there was genetically engineered ingredients included, which would be the better one from your standpoint?
We would want a federal standard that would place the FDA as a mandatory resource for determining what was genetically modified and what was not genetically modified. And we would want the labeling to be voluntary, similar to what we've already have with organic. If someone wants an organic product, they go through an organic certification by the USDA, and we put organic on that. We do not put non-organic on the balance of the products. So it seems to me that forcing a mandatory labeling law onto products that are the predominant ones on the supermarket shelf goes against common sense and goes against convention and practice that we've already have in the food industry.
Well, leaving aside the debate about whether it makes common sense or not, would it be preferable to having 50 different labeling?
Certainly preferable.
Okay. Now, if there was such a label, could it be as simple as would say may contain genetically engineered ingredients? And I don't know what the Vermont one says, but could you envision a national, Ms. Webb, standard that would essentially say something like that?
We do allow for may contain.
Because as I'm thinking about the disruption to the supply chain, it would seem to me that the burden, frankly, would end up being on those who want to be able to establish that their product is completely free of GE, to sort of police that supply chain. So just from a pricing standpoint, the genetically engineered products, even if they had whatever extra costs you might attribute to that requirement added in, would end up being a lot less expensive potentially than the others. I'm not asking a question, I'm just kind of musing here about it. So I guess what I'm trying to sort out is I don't think the public's reaction to knowing that something is genetically engineered is going to be to create some huge distortion in the current nature of demand out there. I think many will say, oh, maybe genetically engineered, I get that. They'll do price comparisons, they'll look at fiber, they'll look at other things, and they'll make a decision on buying the product. And I'm not also convinced that the industry can't handle the sort of supply chain issues in a way that is significantly less expensive than the numbers that are being invoked. But it is a very complicated issue. I come from the perspective that there should be a right to know there, but within the context of that, I'm ready to explore how industry can manage that right to know as efficiently and manageably as possible. Yeah,
it seems to me there is a right to know, and the right to know is to look and shop for, as an organic shopper or a GMO shopper, for those seals that go through a certified and rigorous certification process. That's the lack of transparency, if you ask me. It also, from our members' perspective, gives a marketing advantage to it. And in most cases, these products are more expensive than the, if you will, conventional products that are on the shelf. So, I mean, there is information out there if the intelligent, educated consumer wants to find that product.
And unfortunately, consumers are looking at those claims, natural and organic, and many of them are getting exactly backwards. They're thinking the natural claim that might be on a multigrain tortilla snack chip is the one that's GMO-free, and they look at the organic certification and they don't quite know what that means. And so that's why we think addressing the use of the word natural and having a modest, non-judgmental disclosure would help cure that consumer confusion. Consumers are extraordinarily busy. They're looking for a simple way to know what they're buying so they can use their buying power to shape the market.
Thank you. I yield back.
May I add also that in deference to Mr. Dempsey's concern for smaller businesses, the cost for a small business to go through the non-GMO project is prohibitive for them, and which is why we were looking at the expense to go to the larger industry rather than for people.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green. 5 minutes for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Coming from Texas, though, when you say, you know, it's a multi-grain tortilla chip, you know, corn is corn, but I know my daughter keeps telling me multi-grain chips are much better. Mr. Dempsey, can you elaborate on how you feel the Vermont Act 120 would lead to a consolidation in the industry and with many small businesses forced to close? And also, are the multi-category, multinational players the only companies that can currently have the capability to change their supply chain and bear these type of costs?
Smaller companies, the ones I would define as smaller companies, are plants with, or companies with one plant, one line. Yeah. And as I said in my statements, the closing of those lines takes significant time out of the production process that would not be able to go right from non-GMO to GMO product. So then the companies have to decide whether they participate in the GMO, the non-GMO labeling, or the GMO labeling as it is in Vermont. they'll have to make a decision on what products qualify to go into Vermont without labeling, which ones don't. And a lot of those will determine both the distribution network. Some of those are DSD, some of those are warehouse. How do you leave open your, if you will, your company to fines if the wrong product gets into into Vermont?
Okay. Mr. Faber, according to the non-GMO foods, the U.S. market perspective, GMO foods are expected to account for up to 40% of the market by 2017, representing a value of about $264 billion. You state that consumers deserve a choice of knowing what's in their food, but isn't the market already voluntarily moving in that direction?
Today, only about 3% of SKUs are certified as GMO-free by the Non-GMO Project, and so consumers are much likely to see today a natural claim on their multigrain tortilla chip than to see the little butterfly that means it's been a non-GMO certified multigrain tortilla chip. So consumers are much more likely today and in the near future to think that they're using their buying power to avoid GMOs, if that's what they choose to do, than they would if they're relying on that certification.
Do you think there are any costs shifted to consumers due to the mandatory labeling laws and how they might change the operation of our food supply?
You know, I don't believe that even if we had a modest informational GMO disclosure tomorrow, that you would see dramatic change in buying behavior. And we know because we have GMO labeling in some form or another in 64 other countries, including countries where people eat more or less like us. Brazil's a great example where they've had a GMO disclosure since 2001, and where consumers have conferred a benefit to the GMO disclosure, and that's why they've not seen any significant change in buying behavior. So I'm confident that if we had a GMO disclosure tomorrow, that the food industry would take all the money they've been spending to fight these ballot initiatives, which is now more than $100 million, and invest it into a top-notch consumer education campaign to persuade consumers that GMOs have all the benefits that we've heard about during this hearing.
Well, and I guess that's my concern that, you know, we heard from the FDA, and, you know, with their resources, and of course we decide their resources, do the inspections, but, you know, there's been no proof that GMOs are actually bad to consume. And we also know, and I assume we'll have testimony, this is not the Ag Committee, but we have that some of the GMOs have actually expanded our possibilities for food production, not only in our own country, because obviously we eat very well, but in parts of the world where starvation is an issue, whether it be the GMO rice product that you can, and those have been shown that they're not, they don't harm humans, but it does help the nutrition issues.
And as I said earlier, no one's arguing that farmers should be prohibited from planting GMOs, and GMO traits may indeed provide benefits to farmers or nutritional benefits someday. I think the real question here is whether or not people should be able to decide for themselves, and whether or not FDA has the authority to do so. As Mr. Waxman was talking about earlier, FDA has compelled disclosures simply because of consumer interest. And up until 1992, for the years between 1938 and 1992, understood that word material that we talked about earlier to mean relevant. Was it information that a consumer would want to have in order to make an educated choice?
Thank you for your patience, Mr. Chairman. I know I ran over time a little bit.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize Mr. Pompeo, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Forshee, thank you again for traveling out here to be here. You talked about the costs that would increase your farm, your small business, to operate. I assume you wouldn't just eat those costs. You'd attempt to pass them on as best you could to your customers.
Yes, just like any small business. I mean, I think I left off the fact that we have one full-time hired man as well. So, you know, not only do we farm, but I mean, farming is a business, and that's exactly right. That would have to be passed down.
I appreciate that. I've got a lot of ground. I want to try and get some yes or no answers. We haven't been successful so far today. I'm confident I will be the first to do so. Earlier today, we had FDA witness testify, a very senior FDA official testify. He said that GE foods in the U.S. marketplace today are safe as their conventional counterparts. We'll start on my left to your right and tell me if you agree, yes or no, with that statement.
Yes.
I believe so.
That's a yes. For the record, just yes.
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 Yes, we have total unanimity. That's fantastic. It's one of the first times in this committee we've had that in my 4 years here, so that's all good news. Mr. Faber, you were talking about misinformation out there. I can tell you, you're part of the problem. Your organization is part of the problem. Mr. Matheson asked you about it. You say you don't want a patchwork. You have spent millions of dollars stirring up trouble to create just that patchwork of regulation, and you're continuing to do so today. I'm confident that phones are ringing in my office as a result of your efforts to stir up this very challenge. And so I would just urge you to work to get to the right place. This piece of legislation requires the FDA to define natural, the very thing that you spend so much time in your testimony speaking to. So I'm with you. Yeah. I want that to occur. But when you put out things and you call this piece of legislation the Dark Act, saying we're denying consumers the right to know, there is nothing in this legislation that denies any consumer any capacity to know precisely what it is they are eating. If any willing provider deems it appropriate and finds customer demand to provide information to their customers about the nature of that product, no one's right to know is being impinged today, nor would it be if this bill became law. So as you're out there working to defeat this legislation, I hope you'll be honest in the way you talk to America about this, because it is very important that folks have the right to know. This bill would never impinge on that. So I'm sure today you'll go out and issue something that says that this is not the Dark Act. I look forward to reading that on my website. Mr. Dempsey, you were talking about this. 1 to 10 on a scale, how does this impact the businesses that you represent? If we fail to get this law put into place and a patchwork of rules becomes the norm.
10 being the most difficult scenario?
Sure.
10, for sure.
And so if it's a 10, what is it for the smallest businesses in America?
Multiply that times 10.
Thank you. Ms. Webb, how many FDA-level quality scientists are employed by the state of Vermont today that are reviewing these sets of food rules?
I have no idea.
Do
We
you
are
know?
not trying to compete with the FDA or be the FDA.
So are there any folks that are experts in food safety applied today by the state of Vermont that is trying to put forth a set of rules that I promise you the citizens you represent think have something to do with food safety?
I'd have to get back to you.
You don't know. I would appreciate you getting back with the committee and answering that question. I want to come back to choice, Ms. Fortune. This really comes to you. You're both the producer and the consumer. Today, if you decided that for whatever reason, because you had some personal preference with respect to non-GMO foods, do you think you could walk into a store somewhere, I guess not near you, 20 miles, but somewhere in Kansas, and find that set of products on the shelves? Or if you didn't, contact the providers of those food and say, I want you to label that. You think you could pull that off?
No, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't believe so.
Yeah.
I really don't. Yeah. I mean, I feel that it is safe, and that's what I care about, is knowing that it's safe. But no.
I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right, Chair, thanks, gentlemen. That concludes the questions of the members present. I'm sure we'll have follow-up questions. We'll send them to you in writing. We ask that you please respond promptly. Members will have 10 business days to submit questions for the record. That means they should submit their questions by the close of business on Monday, December 29th. Thank you very much for your testimony, for your willingness to come today. Very important and informative hearing. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.